Hello, this is Mike, and welcome to Urban Legends and Mythology. Tonight, we take a stroll down the streets of Old Whitechapel in London's East End, a notorious slum filled with flop houses, brothels, and saloons, a place where poverty, robbery, violence, and alcoholism was endemic, and a place where many working class women who were unable to escape the crippling grip of poverty were driven to the world's oldest profession merely to survive. In this crammed, overpopulated slum, made up mostly of Irish, Jewish, and Eastern European immigrants, there were an estimated 62 brothels and an estimated 1,200 women working as prostitutes, an extremely dangerous profession in 1888 London. However, this danger would be amped up to 11 because in 1888 a series of grotesque murders started receiving unprecedented coverage in the media. The victims, all prostitutes, working and living in Whitechapel. And the murderer? Well, that was none other than the infamous Jack the Ripper. So, as always, let's start at the beginning. So it's 3:40 a.m. on the night of Friday, August 31st, 1888. And in Bucks Row, a carman by the name of Charles Allen Cross is heading to work, when all of a sudden he comes across what looks like a tarpaulin laying in front of a stable gate. And this kind of catches his eye. It seems kind of off. He's like, what is that? So he goes over there to inspect. So upon inspection, he realized this isn't a tarpaulin at all. This is the body of a woman. The woman lay on her back with her eyes open, her legs straight, and her skirt raised above her knees. Her left hand was touching the gate of the stable. So while standing over this body in what was most likely a state of shock, another passing cart driver on his way to work, a man named Robert Paul, he approaches the location and observed Cross standing in the road just looking at this body. So Cross, he kind of snaps out of this state when he notices Paul is kind of standing there near him, and he calls him over. And they're both examining this body just laying in front of the stable. Cross then bends down to touch the woman's face, to which he notes was still warm. However, her hands were ice cold. He says to Paul, "Hey, I think this lady is dead." To which Paul responds, "Nah, she's probably just drunk and passed out." So the two then pull her skirt down to cover her lower body, and they both go off to find a police constable. So not very far away, at the corner of Hanbury Street and Baker's Row, they encounter police constable Jonas Mizzen. Cross, he then informs the constable of their discovery, and he adds, quote, "She looks to me to be either dead or drunk, but for my part, I believe she's dead," end quote. So Mizzen makes his way over to Bucks Row while these two men, they scurry off to work. Now, neither of the men know it at the time, but they had come across the body of Mary Ann Nichols, also known as Polly Nichols, widely believed to be the first victim of the Ripper's canonical 5. And this discovery would set off a series of events that continue to haunt the imaginations of true crime and urban legend enthusiasts to this very day. So we actually know a lot about Polly Nichols' life. She was born on 26 August 1845 in London. She was the second of 3 children born to Edward Walker, who was a locksmith and later a blacksmith, and his wife, Caroline, a laundress. So she would have grown up working class poor or poor. At the age of 18, she marries a printer's machinist named William Nichols, and the two go on to have 5 children. However, by 1880, their marriage had fallen apart. At one point, it was alleged that William had an affair. However, what seemed to be the catalyst for the eventual separation was Mary's heavy drinking. She had become a full-blown alcoholic, and William later goes on to say that his wife had left him and began practicing prostitution. So during their separation, he's required to pay her something like 5 shillings a week to live on. It's kind of like spousal support. However, he ends this in 1882 after he finds out that she's working as a prostitute. Now, in this interim time between 1881 and 1882, she's in and out of the Lambeth workhouse. She's working as what's known as a charwoman, who's somebody hired to come clean your house once or twice a week. Charwomen weren't considered permanent staff like a maid. They were just somebody who came by once or twice a week to clean, and they got paid in cash usually. And she's obviously supplementing supplementing all of this through prostitution. So she spends the rest of the 1880s living in boarding houses and in workhouses and basically living on the streets. She does shack up for a while with a man named Thomas Stewart, however, it doesn't really last long. And her alcoholism's just getting worse, especially considered that she blows all her money on alcohol. But by April of 1888, she actually gets a bit of a break. So she's at the Lambeth workhouse, and the matron of that workhouse, a woman named Mrs. Fielder, helps her get employment as a domestic servant to a Mr. and Mrs. Cowdrey in Wadsworth. And these were well-off people. They were kind of upper class, and they were known as teetotalers and very religious. She actually talked about this in a letter she wrote to her father about her new employment. However, she doesn't last long in this job. In fact, she only was there for 3 months, and when she left, she stole about £3 worth of clothes, which is somewhat of the equivalent of like 500 American dollars today, and she just disappears back into Whitechapel. So around, I guess, July of 1888, she's residing in a squat or a doss house or a flop house. It's basically just a cheap place where you can rent a bed for a night. And then on August 24th, she relocates to another one of these doss houses. This is the one on 56 Flower and Dean Street. And this leads us to the last night of her life, and we actually have a pretty solid account of this from about 11 p.m. to about the time we find her body at 3:40 a.m. So on 30 August 1888 at about 11 p.m., Nichols is seen walking down Whitechapel Road. She visits the Frying Pan Public House in Brick Lane, where she's seen leaving around 12:30 a.m. At 1:20 a.m., she had returned to the kitchen of the Flower and Dean Street lodging house, or the doss house or flop house, and 50 minutes later, she was seen by the deputy lodging housekeeper, who asked her for the 4 pence that was required for her to stay for the night, which was somewhere around the equivalent of $2 American. So to this, Nichols replies that she doesn't have the money, and the deputy lodging housekeeper kicks her out. So undeterred by this, she motions to her black velvet bonnet she was wearing and says, "I'll soon get my DOS money, see what a jolly bonnet I've got now." And she leaves the house for a final time with a likely intention of raising the money by prostituting herself. And a quick note on that. So this was an alcoholic, essentially homeless woman in her 40s, wandering the streets of Whitechapel. So she would have been considered like the bottom rung when it came to this prostitution hierarchy, because even in this world's oldest profession, there is a hierarchy. There are your courtesans, who are like the mistresses of the social elites, and then there's your kind of, I guess you could call them middle-class young working prostitutes who usually work out of brothels, who can fetch a higher pay. They're usually safer. They're actually taxed by the government. And then there are basically your streetwalkers, your street whores. These were the ones from the lowest social classes. They were usually alcoholics. Most of them would have had some kind of criminal record, and they were doing what they had to do to get through the night, and they were the ones doing it for the lowest bargain budget prices. They were prostituting themselves just to get that 4 pence or whatever they needed to pay for their nightly lodgings, or even to get those next few pints of beer. These are the ones that you see, in a back alley getting that 2 or 3 pumps from another working class dude, just looking to get his rocks off in that moment. Nichols was last seen alive by a friend of hers, a woman named Emily Holland, who was walking alone down Osborne Street at approximately 2:30 a.m., about an hour before her death. And according to Holland, Nichols was totally drunk. At one stage, while they were talking, she was slumped up against the wall of a grocer's shop. So she was like fall down out of it drunk. And at one point during their conversation, Holland attempts to persuade Nichols to return to her lodging house over on Thrall Street, where she had stayed previously. But Nichols refuses by stating, "I have had my lodging money 3 times today and I have spent it," obviously on alcohol. Now, Holland later notes that Nichols seemed completely unconcerned about her prospects of earning that 4 pence that she needed to pay for her lodgings for tonight. And the two part ways, with Nichols walking towards Whitechapel Road. And this is the last time we ever see Nichols alive. So back to Police Constable Mizzen. He just had this encounter with these two guys, Paul and Cross, and he's heading towards Bucks Row. Now, shortly before Mizzen reaches Bucks Row, Police Constable John Neal approached the street from the opposite direction on his beat. Now, like a lot of police constables at the time, Neal is carrying a lantern. That's because these are very dark areas. And as Neal approaches, the light from his lantern falls across Nichols' body, laying there in the street essentially. After this, Police Constable Neal, he flashes his lantern, and this attracts the attention of another police constable named John Thane, as his beat also passed the entrance to Bucks Row. So there's like 3 police constables in the general area while this is happening. And they say police presence deters crime. I digress. So Neal is now shouting at Thane, and he's saying, "Here's a woman with her throat cut. Run at once for Dr. Llewellyn." Now, Neal, then he's using his lantern to kind of inspect the crime scene. He's initially looking for blood trails. However, he finds none. He's also examining the road at this time, and he states that he saw no marks made from wheels. So Thane runs to a nearby house of the surgeon Dr. Llewellyn, who arrives at Bucks Row at 4 a.m. And he quickly, after a brief examination, is able to pronounce her as dead. And he notes that she couldn't have been dead more than 30 minutes due to the fact that her legs and arms are still warm. Now, at this time, they basically ordered Mizzen to go get a hand cart so they can transport this body, and upon Mizzen arriving with the hand cart, Dr. Llewellyn tells Neal, "Move the woman to the mortuary, she is dead. I will make a further examination of her." And at this point, we kind of have to stop and remember that this is the 1880s, so the idea of controlling a crime scene or any kind of crime scene investigation is in its infancy. Even the whole idea of detective work doesn't really exist yet. There's no fingerprinting, there's no blood splatter analysis, there's no DNA, so there isn't much of an idea of preservation of a crime scene. And as news as the murder spread, because it spread very quickly, a lot of people, curious onlookers, they were all kind of converging onto the crime scene. Now, amongst the rabble of the growing crowd, there were 3 horse slaughterers from a neighboring knacker's yard, and they were informed of the murder by Police Constable Thane as he ran past them to fetch Dr. Llewellyn. And as the police later did with everybody in this area, they naturally stopped them, detained them, questioned them, asked them if they saw anything suspicious or heard anything suspicious, and naturally they said no. And throughout the subsequent questioning of all the residents of this area, especially the ones who were living like right on top of the crime scene, the resounding answer was, yeah, even though there were people up and milling about at this time, nobody saw anything, nobody heard anything, nobody at this time thought anything like this was happening. Even the police constables who were walking their beats in the general area all came out and said that they didn't see anything suspicious or hear anything suspicious until they came across the body. So by 5:20 a.m., Nichols' body was moved to the Old Montague Street mortuary, and this is where the injuries to her abdomen were discovered. They were discovered by an Inspector Spratling, who immediately sent for Dr. Llewellyn, who had originally returned home. So Dr. Llewellyn, he comes back to do this investigation, and this is what he finds. And this is going to get very graphic, so don't say I didn't warn you. Both sides of her face had been bruised by either a fist or the pressure of a thumb before her throat wounds had been inflicted from left to right. One of these 2 wounds measured 8 inches and the other measured 4 inches, and the wounds were completely back to her vertebrae. So these were inflicted with great force from a very sharp knife. The poor woman was practically decapitated. Her vagina had been stabbed twice, and her abdomen had been mutilated, with one deep, jagged wound 2 to 3 inches from the left side. Several incisions had also been inflicted across her abdomen, causing her bowels to protrude through the wounds, and 3 or 4 smaller cuts ran down the right side of her body. It was concluded that all cuts were inflicted with the same knife, at least 6 to 8 inches or 15 to 20 centimeters in length, and it was originally speculated that it was possibly the type of knife used by a shoemaker or a cork cutter. Furthermore, each wound was inflicted in a violent downward thrusting manner, and Llewellyn initially opined that the murderer possessed some anatomical knowledge. However, this would come up again and again and pretty much be debated back and forth even up till today. It was also noted that none of the organs were missing. Upon estimation, Llewellyn noted that the injuries would have only taken 4 to 5 minutes to complete, and also expressed his surprise at the small amount of blood at the crime scene, which indicates that her throat was slashed and the rest of the injuries were inflicted post-mortem. However, he did state that her death would have been instantaneous. So it seems like the killer had no interest in sadism or torture or anything like that. However, it's clear and obvious that the killer is deranged. Now, at the time, they have no idea who this person was, so they have to go through the examination and identification process. Now, Nichols had no form of identification at the time, and her sole possessions were a white pocket handkerchief, a comb, and a piece of mirror. However, the first clue to her identification came from her petticoats. They were marked with Lambeth Workhouse PR, indicated that she may have resided at this workhouse at some point recently. And this turned out to be true. Another inmate of this workhouse was able to identify her, and that was later corroborated by another friend and her former husband, William. And this eventually leads into a formal inquest into Nichols' death. And this isn't really a trial, it's more of a public discussion on what everybody witnessed. So they hear testimonies from pretty much anybody who had any kind of relationship with her former husband, friends. They're trying to determine if she was in any kind of trouble or had any enemies or anything like that. And then they interview all the witnesses, including the police constables and Dr. Llewellyn, who had done his autopsy, I guess you could call it. They try to recreate the crime scene and corroborate with each other and see if anybody missed anything. And this inquest takes place on 3 different occasions throughout September. And they basically come to the conclusion that, yes, this woman was Polly Nichols, and we don't know who killed her or why. And at this point in time, nobody's thinking that there's a deranged serial killer on the loose, because this is the first of the canonical 5. And at this point, it's just written off as another Whitechapel murder. Now, the Whitechapel murders are a series of 11 murders between 3 April 1888 and 13 February 1891. And they predate and postdate the canonical 5, and it's believed that only 5 of them were committed by the Ripper himself. The rest were most likely committed by other people, or in one case, a gang of people. And the reason we only attribute 5 of them with the Ripper is because those all have the same MO. The other 6 murders all have different MOs, and it's not typical of a serial killer to just change up their MO like that. Usually they have a method and they stick to that method. So at the time, Polly Nichols, she's just another one of these unsolved cases, which further exacerbates Whitechapel's image at the time of a crime-infested slum. It was a violent neighborhood of impoverished immigrants, and a lot of them were Jewish, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism going on at the time. Couple all this with homelessness, endemic prostitution, and rampant alcoholism, and it's a perfect formula for what became the Autumn of Terror. However, at the time, this was just written off as another Whitechapel murder, and people went about their lives. That is until September of 1888, when the body of Annie Chapman was found just beyond the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street in Spitalfields, which is technically not Whitechapel. It's just a couple streets over from Whitechapel, but still the same kind of slummy, impoverished area. And her body was found with basically the same MO as the first. And when the media are able to basically connect these 2 murders, they incite a panic across London. There is a deranged serial killer out there somewhere in Whitechapel preying on prostitutes, and he has just taken his second victim, Annie Chapman. So Annie Chapman was born Eliza Ann Smith in Paddington on 25 September of 1840. She was the first of 5 children born to George Smith, who was enlisted in the 2nd Regiment of Lifeguards, and Ruth Chapman, his wife or spouse. Now, in her early life, her father's doing various things to earn money. So in 1844, they relocate to Knightsbridge, where George Smith becomes a valet. The family eventually relocates to Berkshire in 1856. Now, according to Annie's brother, he states that Annie had first took a drink when she was quite young, quickly developing a weakness for alcohol. And although he, along with two other sisters, forced her to sign a pledge to refrained from consuming alcohol. According to him, she was tempted and fell. And despite numerous efforts of her siblings to dissuade her from the drink, it was simply too strong of a hold. She was an alcoholic. Believe me, I understand. The hold it has over you is an insane thing. Now, census records from 1861 shows that the entire family except Annie had relocated to the parish of Clewer. However, Annie is believed to have stayed in London, possibly due to her work as a domestic servant. Now, at the time, her father was a valet to a man named Thomas Nair Leland of the Derbyshire Yeomanry Cavalry, and he actually commits suicide at the Elephant and Castle in Wrexham on the night of June 13, 1863, by cutting his throat. Now, the reasons for his suicide are unknown. Maybe he was depressed, maybe he was mentally ill. We just don't know. It's lost to history. Now, at this time, Annie's not really doing too bad for herself. Contemporary accounts describe Annie as intelligent and sociable with a weakness for alcohol, particularly rum. She was described as being very industrious and civil when sober, and she was thought to generally just be a, good, hard-working person. So eventually, on 1 May 1869, Annie marries John James Chapman, who I guess was distantly related to her mother, but it's England, so... And they say American hillbillies are incestuous. But in the years following their marriage, they live at several West London addresses, and John, he obtains employment in the service of a nobleman in Bond Street, probably as like a valet or something like that. So they go on to have 3 children. One is born crippled, and he's actually given to the care of a hospital. And although she had been trying to basically wean herself off of alcohol, it's thought that her son's disability and giving him up led her back to the sweet embrace of alcoholism. But it all starts to really go downhill from here. Now, in 1881, they relocate to Windsor because John takes a job as a coachman to a farm bailiff named Hosea Weeks. And about a year after he gets this job and they relocate, their daughter Emily dies of meningitis at the age of 12. And after this death, it's said that both parents indulged in heavy drinking. And over the following years, she was known to be arrested several times for public intoxication. But this deteriorates their marriage and it leads to their separation. Now, the separation was mutual. Now, John Chapman, he retains custody of their other surviving daughter, their last child, really. And he even pays Annie spousal support of 10 shillings a week via postal money order. And to be honest, I work in finance and I didn't know postal money orders dated back to that far, but apparently they do. And he pays this to her for the rest of his life. So at this time, because of the separation, Annie relocates back to London. But only 2 years later, in 1886, John dies of edema and cirrhosis of the liver. Now, during this time where she's drawing this spousal support of 10 shillings a week, she's primarily living in Whitechapel in flop houses and common lodging houses. Same kind of situation that we see with the other victims. And by 1886, she's actually shacked up with a guy who made wire sieves for a living and consequently becoming known to some acquaintances as Anna Civvy or Siffy. But it's said that after her former husband had died and those weekly allowances had stopped, that he basically threw her out of the house. Obviously one of those broke scumbag dudes that's just using a chick for her money. It reminds me of when I used to work in retail and you used to know who the broke loser boyfriend was because he was always the one begging his girlfriend or baby mama or whatever she was at the time to buy him a video game or something that he saw and wanted, but obviously didn't have the money for himself, but I digress. Now, after the separation, it said that Annie became depressed and seemed to lose her will to live, especially considering she's descending further down the social ladder. Now, by May or possibly June of 1888, Chapman is residing in the Crossingham lodging house at 35 Dorset Street. She's paying 8D, or I guess it was called D at the time. It's like the pre-decimal penny, so 8 pennies a night, for basically an accommodation in what was known as a double bed. Now, according to the lodging house's deputy, a man named Timothy Donovan, He would state that a 47-year-old bricklayer's laborer named Edward the Pensioner Stanley would typically stay with Chapman at the lodging house between Saturday and Monday, occasionally paying for her bed, most likely using her for prostitution services. It said that she made some of her money from crochet work, she made some of her money from buying and reselling flowers, however she supplemented all this through occasional prostitution. Now on September 7th, 1888, a woman named Amelia Palmer, who was I guess a casual acquaintance of Annie, she stated that she ran into her on this day and she appeared visibly pale on this occasion. After having been discharged from the casual ward of the Whitechapel Infirmary, she complained to Palmer of having felt, quote, too ill to do anything. And this could have been a symptom of a disease brought on by possibly alcoholism, or maybe a disease from living in the squalid conditions that she was in. According to the coroner who conducted her autopsy later, he noted that her lungs and brain membranes were in an advanced state of disease which would have killed her within months. However, those few months would never come because this would be her last day on Earth. So shortly after midnight, so it's September 8th now, Chapman's at this lodging house and she's meeting with the lodging house deputy, Timothy Donovan, and the watchman, John Evans, and she basically informs them, hey, I don't have my money for the night. So around this time, she's in the kitchen of the house and she's sharing a pint of beer with the fellow lodger named Frederick Stevens. She then informs another lodger that she had earlier visited her sister in Vauxhall and that her family had given her 5D or 5 pennies. So she then leaves and goes out and I guess buys or acquires a baked potato because she comes back to the house around 1:35 a.m. and eats the potato. And she states to this other lodger, Stevens, that she's going out to earn her bed money for tonight. As she's leaving, she states to Evans, the night watchman, I won't be long, Bromie. See that Tim keeps the bed for me. Evans states he last saw Chapman walking in the direction of the Spitalfields Market. So shortly before 5 a.m., a man named John Richardson entered the backyard of a property on 29 Hanbury Street to check a padlock on a cellar. So verifying that this padlock was still intact, he turns around, sits down on the rear steps of the property to trim some loose leather from his boot. He then exits the property via the front door approximately 3 minutes later, never proceeding beyond the steps to the backyard. He would later testify that he didn't notice anything strange or out of place at the time. Then a few minutes later, at approximately 5:15 a.m., a man named Albert Cadsoch, who lived right next door, right on the other side of the fence at 27 Hanbury Street, he goes out to use the lavatory. Remember, there's no indoor plumbing at this time, so it's a shit house. Now, he has an interesting story, so while he's out there taking care of business, he reports that he hears the voice of a woman saying, no, no, before hearing the sounds of something or someone falling against the fence dividing the backyards of number 2729 Hanbury Street. Now, he believing that it's probably just a neighbor couple having a bit of a row, he doesn't really get up to investigate what's going on. He just finishes his business and goes back home. So then at around 6 a.m., an elderly resident of 29 Hanbury Street named John Davis comes across the body of Annie Chapman. She was lying on the ground near the doorway to the backyard with her head about 15 centimeters from the steps of the property. And this was a horrific scene. And this is how the scene was described by Dr. George Baxter Phillips, who observed it at around 6:30 a.m. The left arm was placed across the left breast. The legs were drawn up, the feet resting on the ground, and the knees turned outwards. The face was swollen and turned on the right side. The tongue protruded between the front teeth but not beyond the lip. The tongue was evidently much swollen. The front teeth were perfect as far as the first molar, top and bottom, and very fine teeth they were. The body was terribly mutilated. The stiffness of the limbs was not marked, but evidently commencing. The throat was dissevered deeply. The incision through the skin was jagged and reached around the neck. On the wooden fence between the yard in question and the net, smears of blood corresponding to where the head of the deceased lay were seen. These were about 14 inches from the ground and immediately above the part where the blood from the neck lay. There was no evidence of a struggle that had taken place, and it was clear that she was alive when she entered the yard. That's the scene right now as this old man is converging upon it. So after this discovery, the old man, John Davis, he alerts 3 men named James Green, James Kent, and Henry Holland to his discovery, and all ran down Commercial Street to find a policeman, as Davis reported his discovery at the nearest police station. So at the corner of Hanbury Street, Green, Kent, and Holland, they find Divisional Inspector Joseph Lunas Chandler and tells him another woman has been murdered. Chandler then follows the men to Chapman's body before requesting the assistance of police surgeon Dr. George Baxter Phillips and more officers. So within minutes, several police officers are on the scene and they're kind of taking control of the situation. And at 6:30, that's when Dr. Phillips arrives. Now, Dr. Phillips was quickly able to establish a definite link between Chapman's murder and the murder of Mary Ann Nichols, which had occurred back on August 31. The MO was the same. Basically, some kind of blow to the face, a deeply slashed throat, which kills the victim instantly, and then gross mutilation to the abdomen before they're kind of posed in this sexually degrading way. So it's apparent now that we have a serial killer on our hands. And these 2 murders specifically stand out from the rest of the Whitechapel murders that are going on at the time. Now, at the crime scene, alongside her body, some other stuff was discovered. So an envelope with 2 pills, which Annie had been prescribed for a lung condition, was found. Now, this envelope comes up later as it contains a crest of the Royal Sussex Regiment, postmarked London, 28 August 1888. And it was initially believed to be traced to a man named Edward Stanley. However, it's a very dubious connection and ends up not really meaning anything, because we know from a testimony that night back at the lodging house that Annie had originally had these pills in a box and the box had broken, and she was observed by another lodger taking these pills out of this broken box and placing them in this envelope that she just acquired from, I think, the mantelpiece in one of the rooms. So the envelope thing kind of leads nowhere. It's a dead end. It's just one of her personal effects found at the crime scene. Also at the crime scene were found a comb and a frayed course of muslin. And it was stated that she always wore these 2 brass rings, and these rings were missing. It was believed that these rings were taken by the killer and pawned. However, Annie had a habit of selling just about anything she owned, or pawning just about anything she owned. And unfortunately, a search of every pawn shop in Spitalfields and Whitechapel turned up nothing. But one thing that was found at the crime scene that was fairly close to her body was a leather apron partially submerged in a dish of water close to a tap. And this kicks off the idea in the press, the moniker of the infamous leather apron. And this was the original moniker for the serial killer who would later become known as Jack the Ripper. So the real story of this leather apron is actually very mundane. So John Richardson, who has been living at 29 Hanbury Street, owned this leather apron, and back on September 6th, his mother had washed it under this tap and kind of left it there to soak. Now Richardson, he's investigated just like everybody else in the area and quickly eliminated. Now there were already rumors of a leather apron wearing killer after the death of Mary Ann Nichols. Back on the 4th of September, a newspaper called The Star reported that a Jew from the district known as Leather Apron was responsible for the Whitechapel murders. And obviously this gets really ramped up because of just general anti-Semitism in the area. And it's kind of like modern news today, whichever news empire you ascribe to. They always want to whip up fear and hatred somewhere. It's their job. However, this doesn't really work out so well for a local man named John Pizer. He was a 38-year-old Polish Jew who made his living making leather footwear. And he was known around the area by his nickname Leather Apron. And this was a guy also known to make threats and intimidate local prostitutes at knife point. And with him having this local reputation, he's actually arrested on September 10th. However, he's released from custody the next day because he had solid alibis for the murders. However, the damage to whatever reputation he had was done because the press and the media basically said, hey, he's the killer. And it was actually in the inquest into the murder of Ann Chapman where he basically had to testify publicly in order to clear his name. And it's believed that he actually went on to successfully sue one of these publications for libel and was given some monetary compensation for their outlandish lies. Because let's be honest, the media does lie. It's like I always say, there is almost no integrity in journalism. It's all propaganda and lies, but I digress. So back to the crime scene. So Annie's body is taken to the local mortuary where a post-mortem is conducted, and Phillips gives us the following conclusions. Chapman's throat had been cut from left to right so deeply the bones of her vertebral column bore striations. She had been disemboweled with a section of the flesh from her stomach being placed upon her left shoulder and another section of skin and flesh plus her small intestines being removed and placed above her right shoulder. Chapman's protruding tongue and swollen face led Dr. Phillips to believe that she may have been asphyxiated with the handkerchief around her neck before her throat was cut, and the murderer had held her chin as he performed this act. The autopsy also concluded that part of her uterus and bladder were missing. Now this part's controversial because it's from here where we get the idea that the killer may have had some kind of anatomical knowledge or medical knowledge. However, since this examination was found in the morgue and not at the scene, it's believed that medical students at the time may have stole these parts in order to sell them or use them as anatomical specimens. Now, this wasn't outside the realm of possibilities in the 1880s. Medical students were notorious for this because in order to become a surgeon or any kind of medical doctor, you needed to work on dead bodies. However, given the extensive mutilation, we just don't know. Phillips also concluded that Chapman did suffer from a long-standing lung disease that was killing her, that she was sober at the time of her death, and that she had not consumed alcoholic beverages for at least some hours before her death. At the inquest, they asked him about the murder weapon. He said it was a very sharp, long knife, probably 6 to 8 inches in length, and the knife that did the mutilation was also the knife that slashed the throat, just like in the ongoing Polly Nichols case. And in these cases, there is a running theme of what kind of knife was used, and there's a lot of speculation into what kind of knives were used. In this case in particular, during the inquest, it stated that it must have been a very sharp knife with a thin, narrow blade and must have been at least 6 to 8 inches in length. The injuries are not consistent with the types of injuries we would see with a bayonet or a sword bayonet. It was speculated that they could have been done by a medical instrument used for post-mortem cases, so for like autopsies. It was ruled out that any surgical tools were used. Also, the types of knives used by slaughtermen could have been used. However, these knives would have had to have been well ground down. For context, slaughtermen are people who work with the carcasses of dead animals. It was also believed that knives used in like the leather trade, for example, wouldn't have had a long enough blade. And this kind of brings up the problem of knives. There are different types of knives for everything. And there are so many trades that use different types of knives, so it's really hard to pin down what trade this person would have or where they would have acquired this knife from. So naturally, all this, there is an inquest into her death. They conclude that this was the body of Annie Chapman. She had no real enemies or anybody out there to get her. She wasn't in any kind of real trouble that would have caused somebody to murder her, and she was probably a victim of the same killer who killed Polly Nichols back on 31 of August. And naturally, the police investigate. They knock on every door in Spitalfields and possibly Whitechapel. They try to find out what the hell is going on. However, they get the same kind of response they get in the Nichols case. We don't know. We didn't hear anything. We didn't see anything. We haven't seen anybody suspicious in the area. Now, at one point during the investigation, a Mrs. Elizabeth Long testified at a subsequent inquest that she was certain that she saw Annie at around 5:30 a.m. She states that she observed Chapman standing and talking with a man at 5:30 just beyond the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street in Spitalfields, and that she was certain that it was Chapman and was certain of the time because the clock had just struck the half hour, 5:30. Long describes the man that she was talking to as being over 40 years old, slightly taller than Chapman, with dark hair, and of a foreign, shabby, genteel appearance. He was wearing a brown, low-crowned felt hat and possibly a dark coat. According to Long, she overheard the man ask the question, "Will you?" to which Chapman replied yes. Now, she is believed to be the last person to have seen Chapman alive and possibly saw her with the killer. This would have happened about a half hour after John Richardson was in the backyard scraping that piece of leather from his boots. But it also would have happened about 15 minutes after the neighbor said that he heard somebody yelling "no, no" and collapse against the fence. So it's a really short time frame between that and 6 a.m., which suggests to me that maybe these people got the time a little wrong, or that the killer was working very fast, which makes me think that maybe he was like a frenzy killer, someone who is just perfectly normal 1 second and then just completely explodes in this violent rage, and then it only takes a few minutes for that to subside and he goes about his way. Now, it seems like at this point the killer cools off for about 2 weeks because we don't hear anything from him again until the infamous double event of September 30th. However, at this time he's probably laying low because after this murder is discovered, London is in a frenzy. The media's gone crazy, thousands of letters and inquests are being written and sent into the police station and all the media outlets, and the police are seen as basically an inept joke. And that was kind of true of the Metropolitan Police and the London Police at the time. They were two different forces in the same city. These were still fairly young organizations. The idea of modern policing didn't exist. Most criminal cases were solved through confessions or, just ratting out your neighbor. They're doing their best, but they're just not taken seriously. And obviously the newspapers are eating this up and fueling it even further. They're like, look at these guys. They're supposed to be, restoring order and deterring crime in these crime-ridden slums. However, a murderer can mutilate a corpse a few feet away from their beat. And at the same time, the general public, they're pretty reluctant of the police. They're like, yeah, if I want somebody to show up a half hour after the fact and ask a bunch of stupid questions, then yeah, I'll call the police. And a lot of local business owners, they were kind of fed up with the whole thing. They felt that the members of the Metropolitan Police weren't capable of offering the level of protection that Whitechapel needed, especially due to the rise in violence and these unsolved murders. And in their eyes, this is bad for their local businesses, so they formed the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. So they hold their first meeting on 10 September, just 2 days after Annie Chapman's murder. And they decide that they're going to form a group of local civilian volunteers who are going to patrol the streets of the Whitechapel district in a search for the unknown Whitechapel murderer. They were also meant to act as kind of a deterrent to crime. They were supposed to run off suspicious-looking characters. And these guys, they were to go out on patrols. Each one was given a particular beat that they were to walk, and they would patrol their beats from around midnight to about 4 or 5 in the morning, whenever daybreak would happen. The leaders of this group were local business leaders. They were headed up by a local builder named George Lusk, who was elected chairman during its first meeting. So the general gist of it all is the committee hires these unemployed men. And these men are all handpicked and I guess vouched for by members of the committee. Each man is given a police whistle, a pair of galoshes, and a strong stick. So essentially a nightstick. Each of these men received a small wage from the committee for their duties, and they went out and patrolled their beat. And every night around 12:30, even the senior committee members would go out and they would inspect and patrol with these men. And it's kind of that homegrown idea of, well, you know what? The establishment's inept. The only person that really cares about my neighborhood is me. So I guess if I want things to be better in my neighborhood, I got to do it myself. I can't depend on a state-sponsored or city-sponsored police force who doesn't give a flying fuck about my neighborhood to create any kind of positive change. And that's the general mindset of a lot of these committee members, and probably the general mindset of a lot of vigilante committees today. And there's kind of an air of truth to that. I mean, what loyalty does a police officer have to a community if the police officer isn't even from that community? But I'm off on a bit of a tangent now. So a big part of this committee's work was to keep the story alive, keep the publicity going, and continue to appeal to members of the community to come forward with any information they may have on these killings. They didn't want these killings to just be written off and forgotten. They wanted to bring this man to justice. And they even wrote letters to the federal government stating, hey, can you offer a reward for the apprehension of this killer? To which the government at the time refused. But that's governments for you, right? Squandering tax dollars on useless programs that enrich their friends. However, when you ask them for, just 50 pounds to help fund a good cause, all of a sudden, oh, we're broke. But I digress. The committee also goes out of its way to employ 2 private detectives to work on the Whitechapel murders without police involvement. So here we are. This time they've formed this vigilance committee and they're patrolling the streets at night looking for suspicious characters. The whole area is just in a general sense of heightened alert, and the police are making inquiries asking everyone in the area if they've seen or know anything about these unsolved murders. And at this time, hundreds of letters are pouring into police stations and news agencies, and all these letters contain details and hypotheses on who the killer may be. And a lot of these people are whack jobs, especially the ones who claim to be the killer. However, on September 27th, a very interesting letter does appear at the Central News Agency, and it's the infamous Dear Boss letter. The Dear Boss letter was dated 25 September 1888 and postmarked and received by the Central News Agency on 27 September. And this one stands out from a bunch of the other whack jobs to the point where it was forwarded to Scotland Yard on 29 September. The letter was written in red ink, was 2 pages long, and contained several spelling and punctuation errors. And the overall motivation of the letter seems to be to mock the investigative efforts and to allude to future murders. It reads as follows. Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about leather apron gave me real fits. I am down on whores and I shan't quite ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope, ha. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send to the police officers, just for jolly, wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away, if I get a chance. Good luck, yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind me giving the trade name. P.S. Wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the red ink off my hands. Curse it. No luck yet. They say I'm a doctor now. Ha. And that's where we first hear the name Jack the Ripper. It has a certain je ne sais quoi about it, a certain ring. It's the moniker that the press really latches onto, and latches onto it hard because that moniker is gonna sell newspapers. Now, it was originally written off as a hoax, and rightly so. It later did turn out to be a hoax, spoiler alert. Written by a journalist to sell more newspapers, but I digress. But a lot of people believe that this letter was from the killer because of the nature of what happened next, which is alluded to in the letter, so I'll get into that. So this is the night of the infamous double event. Now, for context, they call it the double event. They make it sound like the killer was being bold and out there and was like, I'm going to commit 2 murders this night, and I'm going to show the police and the people of Whitechapel what I'm all about. It's nothing like that. The double event happens because during the course of the first murder, he's almost caught, and he hasn't satiated that lust or that feeling of rage or whatever, so he goes out and commits another one. I'll get into more of this later when I go over the psychological profile of the killer, but let's get started. So it's the evening of September 29th, 1888, and the early hours of the 30th, and at approximately 1 a.m. at a place called Dutsfield's Yard, a man by the name of Louis Deemschutz, who was the steward of the International Working Men's Educational Club, drove his cart into this yard. And like everything in this area, this yard was poorly illuminated. Now, all of a sudden, while he's driving this cart into this yard, his horse shies to the left to avoid what appears to be a bundle laying on the ground. Now, Louis, I'm not going to say his last name again because obviously I can't pronounce it. He looks down to see what this horse is shying away from, and he sees what he later describes as a dark object. So he takes his whip handle, the whip that like he uses on the horse or whatever. He reaches down with it and he tries to lift this object, but he's unsuccessful. It's too heavy and it's dark, so he doesn't know what it is. So he gets down off of his cart to inspect, and upon lighting a match, he saw a prone body. So, noticing that this is the body of a young woman, he runs into the club just to make sure his wife was safe, because obviously that's going to be your first thought if you're married and your wife is in the vicinity. So, upon realizing that his wife is safe and sound, he reports what he saw to this group of people in this club, and they immediately disperse to go get help. And I can't imagine what these people are thinking right now. They're at the height of the Autumn of Terror. The Ripper is loose. He's in the newspapers. It's all anybody's talking about. And another body has just been found, and that body was the body of the Ripper's third victim, Elizabeth Stride. Now, Stride was born Elizabeth Gustafsdotter on 27 November 1843 in Sweden. Now, she was the second of 4 children born to a Swedish farmer by the name of Gustav Eriksson and his wife, Beta Karlsdotter. On a side note, I love Swedish surnames. It's so easy to determine where they come from, but I digress. So she grows up on this farm in this little Lutheran village, and around the age of 15ish, she starts seeking employment in her own right. And at this time, she's mostly working as a domestic servant. Now, unlike other Ripper victims who fell into prostitution via failed marriages, fall from grace, etc., Stride becomes a prostitute much earlier in life. In March of 1865, police records confirm her arrest upon this charge, and in the same year she was treated at least twice for venereal disease, most likely from prostitution. At this time she's only 20 years old, but she probably just figured it was a more lucrative career path than just being a boring old domestic servant. However, to be honest, her reasonings for this we'll never know. Probably monetary, in my opinion. So not long after this, in 1866, is when she relocates to London, and her actual reason for relocating from Sweden to England isn't really known. However, she was said to give 2 different reasons, and this kind of comes up a lot in her story. She seems to possibly be like a habitual liar or a storyteller. So to some, she told him that it was due to her domestic service employment, that she was in the service of a quote, gentleman who lived near Hyde Park, which is a very wealthy area. To others, she said it was because she had family in London and her family came to visit them, and when they left, she opted to stay behind. Either way, she ends up in London. Now, some accounts from history state that she may have been quite intelligent because upon her arrival in London, she learned to speak both English and Yiddish in addition to her native language. And the English is obvious, but the Yiddish is also useful if you're moving to a place where there's a large Jewish immigrant population. Somewhere like, let's say, Whitechapel or Spitalfields. However, she's not doing too badly for herself, so at one point in the 1860s, she briefly dated a policeman, and then on March 7, 1869, she married John Thomas Stride. He was a carpenter who was about 22 years her senior. They get married in a modest ceremony, and they go on to reside at East India Dock Road for several years. And the couple aren't doing too bad. They're operating a coffee shop, and John is supplementing that income with his work as a carpenter. And I guess financially it's a little easier because neither one of them has children. However, by 1874, the marriage begins to deteriorate. Now, they continue to live together, but in 1875, John Stride had to sell the coffee shop, likely due to some financial hardship. So the next time we come across Stride in any historical records is in March of 1877 when she was admitted to the Poplar Workhouse, most likely after separating from John again. However, by 1881, they show up again together in census records, living in the district of Bow. So they seem to be one of those couples that's on again, off again in this vicious cycle. However, it is believed that by the end of 1881, they had separated permanently. In December of this same year, Elizabeth is admitted to a Whitechapel Workhouse infirmary, suffering from bronchitis. She's then released from this infirmary on 4 January 1882. After she's released from here, she's believed to have taken up residence in one of the common lodging houses, the flops, the squats, whatever, over on Flower and Dean Street in Whitechapel. We don't hear much from the couple again until 24 October 1884, when John dies of tuberculosis in the Poplar and Stephanie Sick Asylum. Now, in the years during the collapse of her marriage and after the death of her husband, Stride was known to have informed several individuals that her husband and 2 of her 9 children had drowned in the 1878 sinking of the Princess Alice in the River Thames. Now, the Princess Alice was this paddle steamer that sank on 3 September 1878 with a collision with the Collier SS Bywell Castle on the River Thames. Somewhere between 600 and 700 people died on that day, and it was considered the greatest loss of life in any British inland waterway shipping incident. Now, she claimed that her and her husband had employment on this ship, and that she only survived by climbing the ship's mast. But as she had done so, she had been kicked in the mouth by another survivor of the sinking, and this injury to her palate caused her to have a permanent stutter. Now, we know this is all BS because neither her nor her husband ever had children, and there were never any records of her or her husband ever working on this ship. And John didn't die until 1884. So it seems that she was probably a habitual liar or a pathological liar. She probably does this to extort some kind of sympathy from anybody who will listen, maybe to extort a little money. Oh, I'm down on my times, I'm having a hard time, can I have a few pence for whatever? Which, in hindsight, actually shows a propensity towards higher intelligence. Habitual or pathological liars are really good at kind of like that idea of thinking on their feet, and apparently they're really great storytellers, but I digress. So throughout 1885, she's living in these flop houses, where she occasionally receives charitable assistance from the Church of Sweden in London. And it's around this time where she meets a local dock worker named Michael Kidney, and they have a tumultuous on and off relationship up until Stride's death. It's that typical, she lives with him for a while, they get into a fight over whatever, he throws her out, she ends up in the lodging houses, she ends up probably broke, probably tells him a sob story, he takes her back, etc., etc., repeat the cycle, toxic relationship. Now, during this time, her primary profession is that of a prostitute, and she occasionally would earn a little bit of money from sewing and house cleaning, but prostitution was where the money was at. And during this time, like everybody else, she's obviously addicted to alcohol. She appears in the Thames Magistrates Court at least 8 times for drunken disorderly conduct. The final occasion being on September 3rd, 1888, less than a month before her death. So on 20th September 1888, Stride and Kidney once again separates, and she takes residence at 32 Flower and Dean Street. Does that address sound familiar? Because at this point in the show, it should. She tells a fellow lodger that she left because they had a few words, so they probably had a massive row. So over the following few days, she earned regular money by performing cleaning duties both at the lodging house and for local residents. The housekeeper, Elizabeth Tanner, said that she was a quiet woman who occasionally performed cleaning work for the local Jewish community. Probably easy to do because she spoke Yiddish. Now, on September 29th, Stride was known to have cleaned 2 rooms at her lodging house for which she was paid 6 pence. Now, that evening, she gets herself all dressed up. She wore a black jacket and a skirt, with a posy of red rose in a spray of either maidenhair or fern or asparagus leaves. So she's dolled up for a night on the town. So at approximately 6:30, Stride and another lady, Elizabeth Tanner, briefly visited the Queen's Head pub on Commercial Street before Stride returned alone to the lodging house. Now, subsequent eyewitness accounts of Stride's movements later that evening place her in the company of one or more, let's just call them clients. So the first of these was described as a short man with a dark mustache wearing a morning suit and bowler hat, with whom she'd been seen at approximately 11 p.m. So probably not the killer, it's too early in the night. A second eyewitness says that he saw Stride with a man with a peaked cap, black coat, and dark trousers standing on the pavement opposite of number 58 Brenner Street at approximately 11:45 p.m. According to this eyewitness, the two had repeatedly kissed before the man said to her you would say anything but your prayers. Probably alluding to the thought that she was possibly a habitual liar, but that's just my hypothesis. However, my hypothesis, this is probably not the killer either because it's just way too early in the night. And if she's out whoring herself, she's probably just thinking, okay, let's get it over with so I can get on to my next client. So then at 12:35 a.m., Police Constable William Smith saw Stride with a man wearing a hard felt hat standing opposite the International Working Men's Educational Club. So we're literally at the murder scene now. Now he notices that the man is also carrying a package approximately 45 centimeters or 18 inches long. However, Police Constable Smith didn't feel suspicious about this situation anyway, so he just continued on his beat towards the direction of Commercial Road. Now between this time and 12:45, so only 10 minutes, a dock worker named James Brown saw a woman he believed to be Stride standing with her back against a wall at the corner of Brenner Street, speaking with a man of average build in a long coat. He stated that he heard her say, "No, not tonight, some other night." This man was most likely the killer, and the dock worker was probably the last person to ever see Stride alive. So it's 1 a.m., and Louis, he stumbles across the body of Elizabeth Stride, and now everybody's rushing to find a police constable. But what Louis doesn't realize is upon entering this yard, he scares off the Ripper before he can really get to work. Because unlike the rest of the victims, Elizabeth isn't mutilated. She had just recently been killed, probably just a minute or two before Louis shows up in this yard. And this is evidenced by what was found at the crime scene. And this comes from the accounts of the two doctors on the scene. So the first doctor on the scene was Frederick William Blackwell, and then police surgeon Dr. George Phillips. He shows up about 10 minutes later, and they account that fresh blood was still flowing from the single knife wound inflicted into Stride's neck. And even though her hands were cold to the touch, other sections of her body were still warm or quite warm, indicating that she had died extremely recently, like in the span of minutes. And the post-mortem notes give the following account. The body was laying on the near side with the face turned toward the wall, the head up the yard, and the feet toward the street. The left arm was extended, and there was a packet of coccus, which is like a Victoria-era throat lozenge, in the left hand. The right arm was over the belly. The back of the hand and wrist had on it clotted blood. The legs were drawn up with the feet close to the wall. The body and the face were warm and the hand cold. The legs were quite warm. The deceased had a silk handkerchief round her neck, and it appeared to have been slightly torn. I have since ascertained it was cut. This corresponded with the right angle of the jaw. The throat was deeply gashed, and there was an abrasion of the skin about 1¼ inches in diameter, apparently stained with blood under her right brow. And then later on this same day at around 3 p.m., they do another kind of post-mortem investigation into the body. By this time, rigor mortis had set in, so it starts with rigor mortis was thoroughly marked. There was mud on the left side of the face, and it was matted in the head. The body was fairly nourished. Over both shoulders, especially the right and under the collarbone and in front of the chest, there was a bluish discoloration, which I had watched and seen on 2 occasions since. There was a clear-cut incision on the neck. It was 6 inches in length and commenced 2½ inches in a straight line below the angle of the jaw, 3/4 of an inch over an undivided muscle, and then becoming deeper, dividing the sheath. The arteries and the other vessels contained in the sheath were all cut through. The cut-through tissues on the right side were more superficial and tailed off to about 2 inches below the right angle of the jaw. The deep vessels on that side were uninjured. From this, it was evident that the hemorrhage was caused through partial severance of the left carotid artery, and a small bladed knife could have been used. It goes further on to state that there was no recent external injury save to the neck, which shows that there's no mutilation. However, it suggests that the Ripper was interrupted. Now, a lot of people will say that this was a separate case, this wasn't a Ripper murder, because it's just a slashed throat with no post-mortem mutilation. But there was no time for mutilation because as Louis was coming into that yard, the killer had fled. That's why he kills again later that night, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. But we know this is a Ripper murder because the MO is the same. It's a 40-ish year old prostitute. Early in the morning, Whitechapel, deeply slashed throat. Now, both doctors, they opine that Stride's murderer may have pulled her backwards onto the ground by her neckerchief. The bruising on her chest indicates that the Ripper had probably pinned her to the ground before he delivered that death slash. And this all fits in the same MO from the murders we've seen so far. The idea is to kill them fast. Because to the Ripper, the killing's not the important part. The important part is what happens after the killing. But the nature in which he kills Elizabeth is the same as the rest of the canonical victims, which is why I strongly believe that Elizabeth is a canonical victim of the Ripper. And the naysayers, I'm sorry, y'all are just wrong. So back at the crime scene, just minutes after the crime, the police are interrogating everyone who had been at the International Working Men's Educational Club, as well as all the immediate residents of the area. And they were actually able to turn up a lot of accounts. Now, while a lot of the residents didn't see or hear anything, and almost everybody in the club didn't see or hear anything, there are some accounts that stand out. So a man named Israel Schwartz told investigators that he had seen Stride being attacked outside Dutsfield's yard at approximately 12:45 a.m. by a man with dark hair, a small brown mustache, approximately 5 feet 5 inches in height. According to Schwartz, the man attempted to pull Stride onto the street before turning her around and shoving her to the ground. As Schwartz observed this, the assailant shouted the word Lipski. Now, the word Lipski at the time was being used in and around Whitechapel and London's East End as a derogatory term for Jews. It refers to a guy named Israel Lipski, who was a Polish Jew who lived in the East End of London in 1887, and he was convicted and hanged for the murder of a young woman. He forced her to consume nitric acid. So obviously this would have been in the news, the press, and people started using it as a racial slur against Jews. So the assailant, he shouts the word Lipski to either Schwartz himself or a second man who had just exited the club amidst this altercation and lit a pipe. Now, he doesn't testify at the inquest about this. He just gives his account to, I guess, the police. And some people wonder if this was the killer at all. Maybe it was just a robbery. A robbery which just so happened to take place in the same little alley or yard as the killing only a few minutes later. I personally think that Schwartz's story is a little dubious at best. To be honest, I think he just made it up. Because, let's be honest, and I'm talking to all the men out there, I know you're listening because you're like 78% of my audience. Men, if you saw something like that happening, you're gonna intervene. You're not just gonna stand there and watch something like this happen and then run off as some guy shouts a racial slur at you. You're gonna be like, hey, fuck you, get off her, I'm gonna fuck you up. Most men, if they see something like that happening, they're gonna de-escalate that situation somehow. So honestly, I think he just made this story up, which is why he doesn't testify at the inquest. Now, we don't really have much of a description of the crime scene at the time or a lot of evidence. It was noted that there was no money found on her person or around her person, which could have indicated that she was robbed, which is what the people who believe in Schwartz's testimony alludes to, and the people who believe that this isn't a Ripper killing, they'll allude to that. They think that it was a robbery. But it is believed that she willingly entered Dutsfield's yard, and I would bet she most likely entered it with the murderer. I don't believe that he was just sitting there waiting for her, ready to attack. That's not really the Ripper's style. He seems like the person who liked to meet these people. He wanted to gain their trust so he can lure them into dark alleys or dark yards where he could have a little privacy and do his work. So naturally after this, they're investigating the murder and there's an inquest. And since this doesn't exactly have the same MO as the Ripper cases initially, they're looking at all possibilities. Was it a robbery? Was it something to do with her tumultuous relationship with Michael Kennedy, her on-again, off-again boyfriend? Now, he's quickly eliminated as a suspect, and the inquest gets written up as another Whitechapel murder that's unsolved. However, it was not the only murder to happen that night, because less than an hour later in nearby Mitre Square, the Ripper's fourth victim would be discovered, and there was no doubt in anybody's mind that this was definitely a Ripper case. So while all this chaos is going on over in Dutsfield Yard, at approximately 1:44 a.m., police constable Edward Watkins is walking his beat, and he comes to the southwest corner of Mitre Square. Now, he had previously passed through this square at 1:30 a.m., approximately 14 minutes ago, and at that point everything was well and calm. However, as he crossed this area, he came across a mutilated and disemboweled body with her head laying on a coal hole. Upon coming across this body, he immediately runs across the square to the Curly and Tong warehouse and starts beating on the door, trying to get the attention of James Morris, who was an ex-policeman and the night watchman at this warehouse. Now Morris, he's inside and he's sweeping the landings of the warehouse, and he just starts hearing this banging. And he hears Watkins outside the door exclaiming, "For God's sakes, mate, come to my assistance." So Morris opens the door. Watkins, he leads him over to the edge of Mitre Square, and laying on the square is the body of Catherine Eddowes. Now, Catherine Eddowes, she was born in Graiseley Green, Wolverhampton on 14 April 1842. She was the sixth of 12 children, born to a tin plate worker named George Eddowes and his wife Catherine, who worked as a cook at the Peacock Hotel. So a year after she was born, her family moved to London, where her father obtained employment with a firm named Perkins and Sharpus in Bell Court. The family moves around a bit, but mostly stays in London, and Eddowes was actually educated at the St. John's Charity School in Potter's Field. Now, on 17 November 1855, her mother dies of tuberculosis. And sometime between 1855 and 1857, her father dies as well. We know this because in this year, 1857, Eddowes, who was 15 at the time, along with 3 of her siblings, were admitted as orphans to the Bermondsey workhouse, where they attended a local industrial school, which was like a school created for, I guess, disadvantaged children to teach them some kind of a trade. So through this industrial school, Catherine is eventually able to gain employment as a tin plate stamper at the Old Hall Works in Wolverhampton. During this time, she's residing with her aunt, and she's also attending the Downgate Charity School. However, after a few months, she's fired from this job, possibly for stealing, and she has a falling out with her aunt and bounces around a little bit. She briefly stayed with an uncle named Thomas Eddowes, who worked as a shoemaker in Birmingham, where she found employment as a tray polisher, and then after about 4 months, she relocates back to Wolverhampton, where she stayed with her grandfather, who helped her once again get work as a tin plate stamper. She does this for about 9 months and then bounces back to Birmingham. Now at this point, while in Birmingham, she forms a relationship with a man named Thomas Conway. He was a former soldier in the 18th Royal Irish Regiment, and he was receiving like a soldier's pension. And he's probably discharged from the army because of something health related, because it said that he later works when health permits it. Now, there's no evidence to suggest that the two actually ever got married. However, they do have 2 kids, and she even has his initials, TC, crudely tattooed in blue ink on her left arm, which, a female with a tattoo in 1862, especially on the forearm, that was a conversation piece. But it could have been something like a part of her personality. Her friends did describe her as very jolly, always singing, a very intelligent and scholarly individual, however, possessing a fierce temper. So it seems like she could be the life of the party, that person at work who brightens up your day, just don't piss them off. So in 1868, they move to London. They take lodgings in Westminster. And by 1873, their 3rd child is born. And this is where some of the rifts start with her family, because while residing in London, a lot of people say this is when Eddowes took to drinking. And this shows up in a testimony from her daughter, Catherine Annie Phillips, who stated that her parents began living on bad terms, largely because of her mother's drinking, which increased throughout the 1870s, which Thomas, who was a total teetotaler, found intolerable. And by the end of the 1870s, these fights over her drinking had become so violent that she was regularly seen with black eyes and bruising on her face. Now, by 1880, they're residing in a room at 71 Lower George Street in Chelsea with their 2 youngest children, and sometime later in this year is when she leaves Thomas. So by 1881, she's moved to the East End of London, and while residing at Cooney's Common Lodging House at 55 Flower and Dean Street in Spitalfields, she meets a fellow lodger by the name of John Kelly, and the two become acquaintances. Now, John Kelly, he's a local fruit salesman, and the two end up living together, and shortly after, she begins going by the name Kate Kelly. It was also in 1881 where she's brought up on a charge of being drunk and disorderly. She was brought before the Thames Magistrate Court, however, she was discharged without being fined. For this offense, it's probably because she's a first-time offender. Even the deputy of the common lodging house that she frequented stated that she seldom ever drank to excess. However, given her story up till now, we know that she's become an alcoholic, or she's at least struggling with alcohol dependency. Now, initially, while living in and around Spitalfields, Edo is earning money by performing domestic work such as cleaning and sewing for the Jewish community, who's located in nearby Brick Lane. However, it's also believed around this time that she has taken to casual prostitution in order to supplement that income. And by the mid-1880s, her and John had taken up seasonal hop picking work over in Kent each summer. However, this time, the two are basically working poor. It's said that when she was too broke to even afford a bed in a common lodging house, she would typically try to borrow money from her sisters or her daughter. And on occasions where they didn't have extra money to lend her, or I don't know, maybe they got into a fight and they just wouldn't lend her any money, she was known to sleep rough. So she's basically out on the streets for the night. Which brings us to September of 1888. So Eddowes and Kelly follows their annual practice of taking casual work hop picking in the village of Hunting, Kent. Now, while partaking in this casual work, they become acquainted with a woman named Emily Barrell and her common-law husband, and the four of them actually slept in the same barn. At the end of the harvest, Eddowes and Kelly, they return to London on foot with Beryl and her husband, although they part company midway as Beryl and her partner intended to travel to Chittenham as opposed to London. And prior to departing, this woman, Emily, hands Catherine a pawn ticket and says, "I've got a pawn ticket for a flannel shirt. I wish you'd take it since you're going to London. It's only 9D and it may fit your old man." Eddowes places the pawn ticket in this small mustard tin that she carried with her, and the two make their way to London. So they reach London on 27 September and spend the night in a casual ward at the Shoe Lane in the City of London. They slept in separate lodging houses the following evening, Kelly sleeping at 52 Flower and Dean Street and Eddowes at the Mile End Casual Ward. And there's kind of an urban legend that goes that upon arrival at the casual ward, the superintendent asked Eddowes, who had frequently slept at the premises, where she had recently been to, and Eddowes replied that she had been hop picking. And this is the part that we see in legend. She again goes on to state that she intended to claim the reward offered for the rest of the Whitechapel murderer, adding, "I think I know him." Because even though the government wouldn't put up a £50 reward for apprehension of the killer, the commissioner of the city police, Sir James Fraser, offered a £500 reward for any information leading to the arrest of the Ripper. And why that little tidbit, that little note about her collecting the reward falls into urban legend is because the reward wasn't offered until after her murder. At this time, there was no reward being offered for the apprehension of the killer, but I digress. So by the following day, the two had spent almost all of their earnings. At 8 a.m. on 29 September, Eddowes and Kelly, they convene at Cooney's Common Lodging House on Flower and Dean Street, where they have breakfast, they purchase some tea and sugar, and they split their last 6 pence. He takes 4 pence in order to purchase a bed for the night in the common lodging house, and she took 2 pence, which was just enough for her to stay a further night at the Mile End Casual Ward in the neighboring parish. In the early afternoon of the same day, Eddowes informs Kelly of her intentions to travel to Bermondsey to attempt to borrow some money from their daughter, who at this time had married a gunmaker and was probably making fairly decent money. The two of them part ways again around 2 p.m., with Eddowes informing Kelly that she expected to return by 4 p.m. Kelly then goes to a pawn shop and pawns his boots in order to pay for a bed for the night. He ends up arriving at the lodging house at about 8 p.m. and he stays there all night, and this is confirmed by the deputy keeper. Now at 8:30 p.m., Police Constable Lewis Frederick Robinson observed a small group of people converge outside of number 29 Aldgate High Street. And as he approaches this small crowd to see what they're all gathered around, they realize they're gathered around a drunk Catherine laying in the middle of the sidewalk, so drunk that she was completely unable to walk. He assists her to her feet and leans her against the shutters of the house, and she just slumps back down to the pavement. So realizing he can't deal with this drunk lady himself, he gets the assistant of Police Constable George Simmons, and the two took her into custody at Bishopsgate Police Station, and they detained her until she was sober enough to leave. Upon arrival, she gave her name as, quote, nothing, end quote. And after about 20 minutes, around 9 p.m., she falls asleep in the cell. So a few hours later, at 12:30 a.m. on the morning of September 30th, Eddowes is awake, and she asks Constable George Hutt when she could be released, to which he replies, when you're capable of taking care of yourself. After about 30 more minutes, around 1 a.m., she's deemed sober enough to leave, and Hutt escorts her out of the police station. Her final words to him were, "All right, good night, old cock." So she's released from jail, and she still has no money to pay for a bed for the night. So she heads in the direction of Aldgate in order to, let's just say, raise some funds. And it's in this narrow walkway known as Church Passage where she is last seen. So at 1:35 a.m., a man named Joseph Londell and two other guys, they are just now leaving the Imperial Club in Duke's Place on Duke Street. And Londale would go on to testify that at this time, as they were leaving this club, he saw a woman talking to a man in Church Passage. He said that she was wearing a black bonnet and a jacket, she was facing him, and had her hand on his chest, although not in a manner to suggest to Londale that she was resisting him. It seemed to be more like playful affection. He goes on to describe this man as medium build with a fair mustache, approximately 30 years old, about 5'7" in height, and wearing a loose-fitting salt and pepper colored jacket, a gray peak cloth hat, and a reddish neckerchief. In Londale's opinion, the guy kinda looked like a sailor. He said that he walked past them and didn't look back. It's believed that he was the last one to ever see Eddowes alive, because only 9 minutes later, the killer had finished his work. So now we make it back to 1:44 a.m. and Police Constable Watkins has sounded the alarm, and all these police constables are descending upon Mitre Square. About 11 minutes later, at 1:55 a.m., a local surgeon arrives on the scene, and then a few minutes after that, police surgeon Frederick Brown also arrives at the crime scene. And Brown, he goes on to do the post-mortem and give a description of the crime scene, and he states the following: the body was on its back, the head turned towards the left shoulder, the arms by the side as if they had fallen there. Both palms were upward, the fingers slightly bent. A thimble was lying off the finger on the right side. The clothes were drawn up above the abdomen. The thighs were naked, the left leg extended in a line with the body. The abdomen was exposed. The right leg was bent at the thigh and knee. A bonnet was at the back of the head. There was great disfigurement of the face. The throat was cut. Across the throat was a neckerchief. The intestines were drawn out to a large extent and placed over the right shoulder. They were smeared over with some feculent matter. A piece of about 2 feet was detached from the body and placed between the body and the left arm, apparently by design. The lobe and auricle of the right ear were cut through. There was a quantity of clotted blood on the pavement on the left side of the neck, around the shoulder and the upper part of the arm, and fluid blood which had flowed under the neck to the right shoulder, the pavement sloping in that direction. The body was quite warm. No death stiffening had taken place. She must have been dead most likely within the half hour. We looked for superficial bruises and saw none. No blood on the skin and the abdomen or secretion of any kind on the thighs. No spurting of blood on the bricks or pavement around. No marks of blood below the middle of the body. Several buttons were found in the clotted blood after the body was removed. There was no blood on the front of the clothes. Also on her person was the little mustard tin containing the 2 pawn tickets. When the details of these pawn tickets were published on October 2nd, that's when John Kelly was able to identify her. And this identification was corroborated by a few of her family members that they got in contact with afterwards. So that's the crime scene. Then Brown later does the post-mortem, and the post-mortem is as follows. After washing the left hand carefully, a bruise the size of a sixpence, recent and red, was discovered on the back of the left hand between the thumb and the first finger. A few small bruises on the right shin of older date. The hands and arms were bronzed. No bruises on the scalp, the back of the body, or the elbows. The face was very much mutilated. There was a cut of about 1/4 inch through the lower left eyelid, and a scratch on the upper left eyelid near to the angle of the nose. The right eyelid was cut through about 1/2 inch. There was a deep cut over the bridge of the nose, extending from the left border of the nasal bone down near the angle of the jaw on the right side of the cheek. This cut went into the bone and separated all the structures of the cheek except for the mucous membrane of the mouth. The tip of the nose was quite detached by an oblique cut from the bottom of the nasal bone to where the wings of the nose join onto the face. The upper lip was divided by a cut that extended through the substance of the gum over the right upper lateral incisor tooth. There were 1.5 inch long cuts on each cheek, which formed triangular flaps. The cause of death was hemorrhage from the left common carotid artery. The death was immediate and the mutilations were inflicted after death. It goes on to say that there would not be much blood on the murderer. The cut was made by someone on the right side of the body, kneeling below the middle of the body. The peritoneal, or however it's said, I hate medical terms, lining was cut through on the left side, and the left kidney was carefully taken out and removed. Now he goes on to write, I believe the perpetrator of the act must have had considerable knowledge of the position of the organs in the abdominal cavity and the way of removing them, which plays more into that idea that the killer had some kind of anatomical knowledge. However, in these hearings that take place afterward, it's usually agreed that the killer didn't have any explicit anatomical knowledge or skill with like a knife or surgical tools. They seem to be always going back and forth with this question. He goes on in this report to say, the parts removed would be of no use for any professional purpose. It required a great deal of knowledge to have removed the kidney and to know where it was placed. Such a knowledge might be possessed by one in the habit of cutting up animals. I think the perpetrator of this act had sufficient time. It would take at least 5 minutes. And then it goes on to say, I believe this was the act of a single person. Later in the subsequent inquest into this, Brown states that the mutilations to Edo's body had all been inflicted with a knife at least 6 inches in length after death. So we have same MO, same murder weapon. At this point, it's definitely a Ripper case. And this is the case that gets the London police involved because it technically happens in the city of London. However, it was like right on the edge of Whitechapel. It's like you cross the street, that's London. You cross the street again, that's Whitechapel. And the London police, they go all out with this case. In the aftermath, during the investigation, they are doing a literal house-to-house search for anything which may lead to this killer. They even issue instructions that every man in the neighborhood should be stopped and examined. And even during the inquest into this murder, they bring in a man called Frederick Foster, who was an architect who had produced a plan of Mitre Square. And he stated that an individual could easily walk from Burner Street, which was the site of the murder of Elizabeth Stride, to Mitre Square in a matter of 12 minutes. And with the gap of time leading from when Eddowes is murdered and the killer runs off to Police Constable Watkins finishing his 14-minute beat and returning to Mitre Square, that was plenty of time for the killer to get over to Mitre Square, meet up with Eddowes, and commit his horrendous act. However, it's shortly after this murder is committed when we find a clue which definitely points towards the Ripper, and it's about an hour after the body is found at around 2:55 a.m., September 30. So outside of a tenement on Gloucester Street, a police constable by the name of Alfred Long is walking his beat. And while he's walking this beat, he looks down and he sees this bloodstained fragment of an apron that wasn't there when he had previously walked by at 2:20 a.m. It's also noted that this apron was also contaminated with fecal matter. Now, this is later definitively proven to be a piece of apron from Catherine Eddowes. It's believed that the Ripper could have used this piece of apron in order to basically clean his hands up after the murder. This does explain the blood and the fecal matter, which obviously came from Eddowes' intestines. So this is definitive proof that the killer was definitely in this area at the time, sometime between 2:20 and 2:55 a.m. Whether he was in the tenement building, whether he had fled somewhere else, we don't know. However, one other thing does stand out at this scene. Scrawled on the wall in chalk, right near where this piece of bloodied apron was found, was some anti-Semitic graffiti. Now, there are a few conflicting accounts of what exactly it said, but it's commonly held to have read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Now, this is where another little bit of the urban legend plays in, because a lot of people believe that the killer scrawled that on the wall as he was making his mistake, as possibly a way to implicate the Jewish population of Whitechapel as having something to do with these murders. However, we do have to remember this is 1888 Whitechapel, and they do have a big Jewish immigrant population, and anti-Semitism is rife throughout the city. So anti-Semitic graffiti would turn up all over Whitechapel. So personally, I think it's just a mere coincidence. I don't think that was the murderer per se. However, the police at the time did not want to take any chances, because since the murder of Marianne Nichols back on 31 of August, there were rumors circulating that the killer was a Jew. And this was creating a lot of tension in the air. So fearing that after this murder, something inflammatory like that would set off a riot, the decision was made by the Whitechapel police to wash that graffiti off of the wall. Now, the London police were a little irked about this because even though this was Whitechapel jurisdiction, they felt that the graffiti should have been photographed before it had been washed off. It could have helped the investigation. However, the decision was made, and by 5 a.m. it was washed off of that wall, all out of a fear that an anti-Semitic riot would ensue throughout London. And every resident in the area from 108 to 119 Gloucester Street were interviewed about their whereabouts of the murder and if they were aware of this graffiti and who did it and when did it happen. However, they were never really able to gather any real information that led to the killer or whether or not the killer wrote this graffiti or who even wrote this graffiti. As I said, myself personally, I don't believe it was written by the killer. I think it was just a coincidence that apron had been dropped or possibly thrown down by the killer after he wiped his hands, and that it was just another random piece of anti-Semitic graffiti which was in London at the time. And from what I've read, I think most people, the ones who investigated this case then and even now, kind of agree that it's not related to the case in any way other than through mere coincidence. But there is that group out there who think that he did this to throw the cops off of his trail, possibly to implicate some Jewish guy like that Pizer guy who was also known as Leather Apron, who a lot of people were eyeballing for this murder or series of murders. So in the aftermath of this double homicide event, more letters are pouring into the news agencies and the police stations. And as always, they are written mostly by crackpots, but another one stands out, and that's called the Saucy Jack postcard. It becomes famous, just as famous as a Dear Boss letter, because they were written by the same hand. This postcard is received by the Central News Agency of London and is postmarked 1 October 1888. That is important, and I'll get to why here in a little bit. The text of the postcard reads, "I was not codding dear old boss when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jack's work tomorrow. Double event this time." Number one squealed a bit, but couldn't finish straight off. Had not time to get ears off for police. Thanks for keeping last letter back till I got to work again. Jack the Ripper. Now, some people out there, they argue that this postcard was written before the murders were publicized and it contained information that only the killer would know. However, by the time it was sent and postmarked, more than 24 hours had passed, and in those 24 hours, the whole of London knew every detail of this murder. Hell, I would argue that by 5 a.m. in London, everybody knew about this double homicide. And this postcard, along with the Dear Boss letter, were later confirmed to both be hoaxes by a journalist writing for the Star. And the purpose was twofold. For one, he worked for the Star, and you gotta sell newspapers. And this is kind of the birth of the era of yellow journalism, where journalists were just writing whatever the hell they wanted to sell newspapers. It didn't matter if the truth was fudged a little or not, because who's going to know the difference? Especially when you're the media outlet who's controlling the story and no one's holding you accountable. But the other reason why they do this is to keep public interest in these murders alive. There's an incentive to keep the public interested in these cases, which puts pressure on the police forces to find out who this killer is, and hopefully bring this killer to justice and give closure to the families of these women. However, it seems then that there's an interim of about a month and 9 or 10 days where the killer, he seems to cool off again. And this is common with serial killers. They'll go through these cooling off periods because they've got that gratification or whatever that they were trying to get through these horrendous acts. So they're satisfied for a while, and then that tension or whatever builds up again and they need to seek out more gratification. But throughout October, it seems like the killer is in this cooling off period. All seems fairly quiet, so the police are investigating. They're going around and knocking on every door, pulling suspicious people off the street. They're trying to find out who this killer is. They're doing their best. And the Vigilance Committee, they're out there every single night running off creepy looking dudes and doing their best to help support the fledgling police forces. But something very interesting happens on October 16th. George Lusk, that chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, he receives a very interesting letter which was postmarked on 15 October. He receives it the next day. And along with this letter comes a package which contains half of a human kidney preserved in spirits. This is the infamous From Hell letter, and a lot of people believe that this one was written by the killer's hand. And there are several reasons for that, which I'll get into during this segment. The text of this letter reads as follows. From Hell. Mr. Lusk, sore, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you. T'other piece I fried and ate. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you only wait a while longer. Signed, Catch Me If You Can, Mr. Lusk. Now, this letter stands out because it's completely different from other letters which were pouring in by the hundreds, maybe even the thousands, into the newsrooms and police departments all over the city. It's very short and to the point, and it has a very distinct, kind of dark, mocking tone to it. And then there's the simple fact that it was sent to Mr. Lusk, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, instead of some newspaper or police department. This might indicate that he knows that Lusk and his men are the ones really out there, kind of leading the local neighborhood charge to come across this killer, to find him. And this letter has been scrutinized over the years, and it's thought by many experts to be an authentic letter from the killer himself. Now, unlike other letters, it's not written with a light, cool hand, which somebody who writes all day long, for example, a journalist would have with this perfect handwriting. This is written in more of the fashion of I guess you could say semi-literate scroll. The formatting of the letter features a cramped writing style in which the letters are pressed together haphazardly and many ink blots appear, which may suggest that the writer wasn't too familiar with using a pen. And while the writer was literate enough to observe things like the silent K in knife or the silent H in while, he does make various spelling errors throughout the letter. Reading the letter, it looks like he writes it in the style that he talks, and it's suggested that he could have been Irish in origin or an Irish transplant. And that's due on other contextual clues in the letter. One contextual clue being the way he wrote preserved. He wrote it as preserved. It denotes somebody who may be a little bit better than functionally literate. Now, it is suggested that it was probably created by somebody, another crank, another hoaxer out there who was kind of disguising their writing style in order to mess with Mr. Lusk, because he was receiving various letters also from a lot of cranks out there. But if you look at the handwriting, you don't see a lot of pauses when it comes to that. Usually if somebody's trying to disguise their handwriting or fake something, there's a lot of pauses and there's not a lot of flow. This letter seems to have flow for the most part. There's not any abrupt pauses where a person's sitting there going, okay, how do I form this next letter in order to make it look a little more shabby or less literate? It doesn't seem to exist in this case. This had to have been written by somebody who was typical of Whitechapel or Spitalfields, just enough literacy to get by. Maybe you understand that knife has a silent K, for example, but their handwriting style isn't going to land them a job in a journalism room anytime soon. Now, for me personally, given what I know about the killer, what I've read, all this stuff, it's really hard to say whether or not this was written by the killer, because even the stuff around the kidney that came in this package is also disputed. Just like most of the stuff in this case, it's all disputed and it's super frustrating. So what we know about the kidney is it was definitely a human kidney. It was from the left side of the body. One examiner who was said to have examined this kidney said it came from somebody who suffered from alcoholism and Bright's disease. Other people say that there's no definitive way to know that. The doctor who gave that account also stated that it was from somebody who would have died within the last 3 weeks. I have no idea how he would have determined that. We do know that it was preserved in alcohol. All we know for 100% certain is that it's a left kidney and it is a human kidney. Now, it is true that Edo's left kidney was removed, and this was public knowledge. Up to this point, it's believed that the killer did have a propensity for harvesting organs, let's just say. But even that's disputed because in the previous murders, it's thought that it could have been medical students stealing these organs from the corpses for their examinations or to have as medical specimens. This is rampant in the 19th century, which reminds me I really need to do an episode on the whole practice of body snatching, because that is mired in myth, urban legend, and a lot of truth. Maybe that'll be a bonus in between seasons episode, or I might just bump something out of the lineup in the 5th season for that because it sounds like a fun topic. But getting back to the kidney, a lot of people believed, and even Lusk at the time believed, that this was a prank perpetuated by medical students. And it made him initially dismiss the letter and the kidney as another hoax until his friends convinced him to basically turn it over to the police department. And this is why trying to investigate this case or these cases is so frustrating, because you have all these crazies out there who are screwing up crime scenes, possibly messing with the corpses, taunting the investigators, pretending to be the killer, pranking the investigators. On top of that, you have these dick journalists sending in false letters as well. Now, it's not all pranksters and bad people. Some of them wrote to the police with good intentions and potential leads. But there's a reason why you don't interfere with a police investigation, why you don't mishandle evidence or loot corpses. Except for in Dungeons and Dragons or in a video game, then you always loot the corpses, but I digress. But the problem is when you do that, when you interfere with a police investigation like that, you make it so the killer gets away. You make it so he's able to strike again, which he does on 9 November 1888. And this is the most brutal brutal, horrific slaying we ever see, because this time around, he has time. And this one's a little controversial because up until now, his killings have been out in the open. However, this one takes place in a private residence, so a lot of people question whether or not this is the killer or if it's a copycat. However, I must say, if it is a copycat, it's an extremely good one because the MO is the same for the most part. The only difference is this takes place inside of a building, and it seems to take place over, I think, 2 hours, but I'll look back into that when I get into this next segment. But real quickly, before I dive into that, one last thought or comment on the From Hell letter. And this comes from a contemporary police lead at a shop on Mile End Road. So this police lead found that a shopkeeper named Emily Marsh encountered a visitor at her shop with an odd, unsettling manner in both his appearance and speech. Now, this mysterious visitor asks Marsh if she knows the address of Mr. Lusk. She gives him the address and he scribbles it down in this personal notebook of his. After this, he just kind of abruptly leaves. This happens on October 15th, the day that the From Hell letter is written and postmarked. And it's in the area near where it would have been postmarked that day. He was described as a slim man wearing a long black overcoat about 6 feet in height, and he spoke with a distinct Irish accent. He had a dark beard and a dark mustache. Now, was this the writer of the From Hell letter? We have no idea. Could it have been the killer? We have no idea. More than likely, it was another one of these whack jobs who were sending letters to Mr. Lusk. However, it seems to be another part of the mystery that we will never know the answer to. So here we are, November 1888. We are at the tail end of the infamous Autumn of Terror, and the final victim of the canonical 5 will be found in a room in Spitalfields, and this will be the most brutal crime scene the Ripper has ever left us. So on the morning of 9 November 1888, a landlord sends his assistant, a former soldier by the name of Thomas Boyer, to the home of Mary Jane Kelly in order to collect rent. Mary was 6 weeks behind on her rent payments and owed her landlord 29 shillings. And the landlord was sick of waiting, so he sends his guy out there to see what's going on. So Boyer, he arrives at this address, 13 Miller's Court in Spitalfields, and knocks on the door of the room that Mary was renting. And this was literally a sparsely furnished downstairs room. So shortly after 10:45 a.m., he knocks on the door but receives no response. He then tries looking in through the keyhole, however, he doesn't see anything. Probably because he's looking through a keyhole. He then attempts to turn the handle, but naturally the door is locked. So he realizes, well, if I can't get in through the door, I'll see what's going on through the window. So he goes over to the window, which is right next to the door, and there's a broken window pane there. And hung up over this broken window pane is a coat that they just use to basically block out the cold air from getting into the room. It's a lazy fix, but I guess when you're poor, it's better than nothing. So he pushes aside this coat and he sees a brutally horrific scene. Basically the stuff of nightmares. It turns this former soldier into a stammering mess. And by the time he gets to the police, all he can do is stammer out the words. Another one, Jack the Ripper, awful, McCartney sent me. He had just stumbled across the body of the tenant he had been looking for, Mary Jane Kelly, the Ripper's 5th and final canonical victim. Now, unlike the other 4 canonical victims, Mary's life is a little more obscure. A lot of her early life wasn't documented, or if they were, those documents have been lost. A lot of the accounts we get from her contemporaries, people who knew her, say that she likely embellished a lot of her stories, so they have to be taken with a grain of salt. But according to one person who knew her, a man named Joseph Barnett, who was the guy she most recently lived with prior to her murder, she told him that she was born in Limerick, Ireland around 1863. Now, whether she was referring to the city or the county, it's not known. If I were to guess, I would probably say the county. And at some point when she was a child, her family had moved to Wales. She goes on to state that her family was moderately wealthy and this is corroborated by a landlady that she also told the same story to. She gives her father's name as a man named John Kelly, who worked at the ironworks in 2 Welsh towns, which names I am not going to try to pronounce. Sorry, Wales, I love you, but your language is insane. This guy Barnett, he also recalls that she had mentioned that she had up to 7 brothers and at least 1 sister who worked in London. Now, her landlord described her as being an excellent scholar and an artist of no mean degree. That is his quote. However, she was possibly illiterate because, according to Barnett, that in the months leading up to her murder, she would ask him to read her the newspaper articles about the Whitechapel murders. But some other things we do know about Mary is that at the age of 16, in around 1879, she had reportedly married a coal miner by the name of Davies. And just 3 years after they were married, he was killed in a mine explosion. So after this, at around the age of 19, she relocates to Cardiff, where she's living with a cousin. And it's believed that this cousin was the one who introduced her to the life of prostitution. By 1884, she's living in London, and she eventually becomes acquainted with this French woman who hires her to work in one of her high-class brothels. Around this time, she's about 21 years of age. And this brothel was in the more affluent West End of London, and she quickly becomes a very popular girl. So going back to that hierarchy, she's higher up in this hierarchy than like the street whores. She's earning a real living, she's making good money, and she's able to buy like nice, fancy, expensive dresses and stuff. However, she does have a falling out with this brothel owner or whatever, because she leaves for France but comes back after 2 weeks, stating that she didn't like the life over there. And not long after her return, she actually goes to the home of this French lady in order to demand the return of some dresses that she owned. And this couldn't have ended up too well, because she's basically at this point hiding out in London's East End. Probably because this is a violent and brutal industry to be in. And a lot of people like myself believe that she's hiding out in the East End in the slums for a couple of reasons. For one, she's trying to hide from this madam or her enforcers or whatever, who just see her as nothing more than a commodity and are probably furious at her for some reason, so she's trying to avoid any kind of retribution from that. And she's also in the East End because she's no longer employed in this high-class brothel, or any brothel for that matter. At this point in 1885, she's broke and she's living in common lodging houses. It's that same quote that my generation says today: we're all just 2 missed paychecks from homelessness. And throughout 1885 and 1886, she's moving around a little bit. However, she's gravitating towards this poorer end of East London. By 1886, she's residing at Cooley's Lodging House in Thrall Street, Spitalfields, and we actually know the date. On April 8th, 1887, she became acquainted with 28-year-old Joseph Barnett, who worked as a fish porter at Billingsgate Market. And on April 9th, only 1 day after meeting for the first time, they decide they're gonna live together. Now, by this time, Mary has become an incorrigible drunk. They're actually evicted from one of their lodgings for not just mispayment of rent, but because of drunken disorderly conduct. So by early 1888, they're living at 13 Miller's Court in Spitalfields. And they're living in this very sparsely furnished room. It's actually at the back of 26 Dorset Street, Spitalfields. It was originally a back parlor that the owner just kind of walled off in order to create additional accommodations. This room basically had a bed, 3 tables, a chair. Wait, that sounds weird. It sounds backwards. No, that's right. I'm looking at it right now. A single 12-foot square room with a bed, 3 tables, and a chair. Why wouldn't you have 3 chairs and a table? That makes a lot more sense. I digress, I'm off topic. The room also had a fireplace. Over the fireplace hung a print of the Fisherman's Widow, and there was a small tin bath beneath the bed. Now, Mary had actually lost her door key at one point, and instead she would bolt and unbolt the door from the outside by putting her hand through a broken window beside the door. A German neighbor later stated that one time while drunk, Mary had punch this window out, and they would often just hang a coat over it to keep out the draft. Now, at this time, her friends and her landlord, they would all state that she was a very quiet woman when she was sober, but noisy when in drink. They said that she could often be heard singing drunken Irish songs until the early hours of the night. She could become quarrelsome and abusive to those around her. She was basically described as the stereotype of the Irish drunk. Now, in July of 1888, Barnett, the guy that she was living with, he lost his job in the fish market, reportedly due to committing theft. And as a result of this, Mary took to prostitution in order to, pay their rent or their daily living expenses or whatever. And she too has now slid way down that social hierarchy when it comes to prostitution. She was once a high-priced brothel girl who was very popular, and now she's basically a moderately priced, I guess you could call her a house whore. Now, while she's doing this, she's obviously in contact with other local prostitutes because, when you're in a business or a game, you just kind of gravitate towards those same types of people who are in your business, which is true. Back when I did firearm sales, I only really associated with firearm salesmen. Back when I was an archaeologist, I really only associated with archaeologists. Now I'm in finance. All my friends are also in finance. So it makes sense that once you're a prostitute, a lot of your friends and associates are going to be fellow prostitutes. But Mary, she would take pity on some of these, street walking whores, and she would allow them to lodge with her on especially cold and bitter nights. Now, at first, Barnett, he was tolerant of this, but eventually it got to the point where he was sick of her basically just allowing these hookers to sleep in his single room that he shared with this lady night after night. So on October 30, Barnett, he's had enough of this and he just moves out. However, he doesn't just drop her and move on with his life. He is there every day from November 1st to the 8th, usually visiting her to give her money. I guess they still have an ongoing relationship. He just realizes that he can no longer live with her. Now, on November 8th, he visits her for the final time between 7 and 8 p.m., and she's there with an acquaintance of hers named Maria Harvey. He apologizes for having no money to give her, and both he and this woman, they leave Miller's Court around 8 p.m.-ish. He returns to his lodgings where he's reported playing cards with other lodgers until 12:30 a.m. Then he finally falls asleep for the night. Now, in the early evening, Mary was seen at the 10 Bells Public House having a drink. Later that evening, she's seen having a drink with two acquaintances at the Horn and Plenty pub on Dorset Street. Later that night, at around 11:45 p.m., a neighbor of hers runs into her. She's quite drunk. She's standing there with a John, getting ready to, make a few bucks. And she's decidedly drunk, and she's later heard by this neighbor singing well into the early morning hours. At around 1:30 a.m., it was reported by a neighbor who lived in the room above Kelly that the singing had stopped. It's believed at this time she went out again, probably to procure more alcohol or more money. Shortly after 2 a.m., she runs into an unemployed laborer named George Hutchinson. She asks him if he has sixpence that she can borrow, and he tells her, "No, sorry, love, I've spent all my money yesterday. I'm broke right now." After this brief encounter, Hutchinson states that he saw her walking off in the direction of Thrall Street, where she was approached by a man of Jewish appearance who was aged about 34 or 35. Now, Hutchinson would later go on to claim that he was initially suspicious of this guy because his opulent appearance made him kind of stand out as not a normal character of this area. And the man, he tipped his hat down over his face in kind of an obvious attempt to hide his features from Hutchinson. Now, whether this was the killer, we don't know. It could have just been some John from a wealthier area who was probably embarrassed to be seen in this area, or possibly embarrassed at the thought of being recognized. Hutchinson then states that he heard Mary saying, "All right, come along, my dear, you'll be comfortable," as they went to her home at 13 Miller's Court. This was around 2:45 a.m. Now, this is really the last time she's seen alive. Now, the woman who lived directly above her, as well as another woman who lived nearby, both said that around 3:30 a.m. they heard the faint cry, "Murder!" But cries like this were very often, especially amongst the drunks and the rowdies in this area, that they both ignored it and went back to bed. However, a lot of people do believe that this was Mary's final kind of screech before she had expired. Now, upon discovery of her body the next day, it was almost pandemonium. News of another Ripper victim spread throughout London's East End rapidly, and by about 1 p.m. there were crowds of over 1,000 hanging around Dorset Street. However, at this time, the crime scene was actually tightly controlled and very well detailed. Now, upon hearing of the murder, news of it was instantly telegraphed to Scotland Yard. Another Ripper murder had taken place, and they requested the assistance of bloodhounds to see if they could use them in order to track who this killer was, or where he went in the aftermath. However, that was dismissed as being impractical. There's just too much chaos going on at the moment. So you got these guys from Scotland Yard down here, you got the police constables down here, and then you get the surgeon, Dr. Phillips, down here, all at the crime scene. And at 1:30 a.m., the room is ordered to be broken into. A fire was still burning in the fireplace, apparently fueled by women's clothing, which was later thought to have been used as fuel in order to provide light for the killer's mutilation practice. And 2 official photos were taken of Kelly and the crime scene itself. Now, the mutilation of Mary's body was by far the most extensive of any of the Whitechapel murders. During her autopsy, it was estimated that these mutilations would have taken at least 2 hours to perform. In this case, given the privacy of the room, the Ripper was able to take his time. And this is corroborated with some of the notes from the crime scene and the post-mortem investigation. Some excerpts from these notes state, "The body was lying naked in the middle of the bed, the shoulders flat, but the axis of the body inclined to the left side of the bed. The head was turned on the left cheek. The left arm was close to the body, with the forearm flexed at a right angle and lying across the abdomen. The right arm was slightly abducted from the body and rested on the mattress. The elbow was bent, the forearm supine, with fingers clenched. The legs were wide apart, the left thigh at right angles to the trunk, and the right forming an obtuse angle with the pubis. The whole of the surface of the abdomen and thighs was removed, and the abdominal cavity emptied of its viscera. The breasts were cut off, the arms mutilated by several jagged wounds, and the face hacked beyond recognition of features. The tissues of the neck were severed all round down to the bone. The uterus and kidneys with one breast were found under the head, the other breast by the right foot, the liver between the feet, the intestines by the right side, and the spleen by the left side of the body. The flaps were removed from the abdomen, and the thighs were on a table. The bed clothing at the right corner was saturated with blood, and on the floor beneath was a pool of blood covering about 2 square feet. The wall by the right side of the bed and in a line with the neck was marked by blood which had struck it in several places. And it goes on and on and on. Now, Phillips, the man who examined this body and wrote this report, he goes on to state that the knife used was about 6 inches in length, and he did not believe that the murderer had any medical training or knowledge. He later writes, in each case, the mutilation was inflicted by a person who had no scientific nor anatomical knowledge. In my opinion, he does not even possess the technical knowledge of a butcher or horse slaughterer, or a person accustomed to cut up dead animals. Which brings us back to some of those nodes of contention as to whether or not the killer had any kind of scientific or medical knowledge. I personally don't believe he did. Or if he did have any kind of anatomical knowledge, it wasn't apparent when it came to these murders. Of course, the whole case with Mary Kelly has a lot of detractors who state that this possibly wasn't a Ripper murder, but was a copycat murderer. Due to various differences, she was younger than most of the Ripper victims. She was only 25 as opposed to in her 40s. She wasn't your lowest class street whore. She wasn't killed out in the open, and it wasn't a fast, brutal attack and mutilation that happened in a matter of minutes. However, this happened in a private room over a matter of hours. I can see some of the logic behind those arguments, but personally, if I were an investigator in this, there would be no doubt in my mind that this was a Ripper killing because it does follow some of the other classic elements of a Ripper killing. There is extensive mutilation of the corpse. The mutilation of the bodies all happens post-mortem. There's no sense of masochism here. The death is very quick, that single knife cut to the throat, and the same kind of areas of the body are attacked like we see in almost every case. The main difference being he was in a private room where he couldn't be bothered, so he allowed himself more time to, I guess, do his work or gain more satisfaction out of it. However, she becomes the last of the canonical 5. Now, there are more murders that take place in Whitechapel. However, a lot of those don't fit the same MO as the killer. Killers rarely change up their MO. So I guess that brings us to what is the psychological profile of the killer? I've been bouncing around those details for about 2 hours now, but I haven't really done a deep dive into it yet. So in this next segment, I'm going to go into that. So just based on what we've seen so far, what can we say about the killer? Obviously, he works alone. He's using a knife for these attacks, so he might be familiar with knives, or knives are just something that is very accessible to him. All of the murders take place within a mile of each other. It's believed that the hunting ground was just over half a square mile in size, and they seem to concentrate around Flower and Dean Street and Thrall Street. The killer most likely lived in this area and knew the area well. And the killer is targeting the lowest of the low when it comes to social class and social status. His targets are prostitutes, and not just any prostitutes, but the lowest of the low prostitutes. The ones who are dealing with housing insecurity, food insecurity. They're notorious for drinking, and they have reputations in their neighborhood as being drunks or a little aggressive when they get drunk. They're coming from broken homes and workhouses and poverty, and these women seem to be the ones that he preys on. Now, it could be that he's preying on them because he thinks, well, they won't be remembered or forgotten or missed. But it's more likely he's preying on these women because they may remind him of somebody like his mother or somebody else in his life, a female who had some control over him, especially during his youth. And that's what leads us to things like the mutilations and the possibility of sexual gratification from these mutilations. Now, it's stated that the Ripper did not sleep with his victims, either before death or after death, and that the sexual gratification came during the mutilation of the corpses. If there was any sexual gratification at all, it's hard to say. However, we do know he's getting gratification out of destroying the faces of these victims, symbolically destroying them as a person. And we know he's attacking areas such as the vagina, the sexual reproduction organs. He also seems to have a propensity to play with or pose the intestine. And he seems to always pose the victims in some kind of sexual derogatory way. And all the victims generally seem to be laying on their backs when they're found. And in the final case with Mary, it seems that she's already laying on the bed waiting for this sexual act to occur. So she feels comfortable around this guy up until he slashes her throat. And it seems like that's the case with all the victims. They feel comfortable around the guy. He's lured them into a false sense of security that he's just here to, get his rocks off and then pay her and he'll be gone. So he probably doesn't have a sense or a reputation of violence against women, at least not when they're alive. Now, in looking into the psychological makeup of the killer, I came across an article from the Texas State School of Criminal Justice, which gives us an interesting breakdown of the psychological makeup of this killer, and it is as follows. In 1998, the FBI prepared a criminal personality profile for the Jack the Ripper murders. After an analysis of the crime scenes, police and autopsy reports, photographs, victimology, and area demographics, the following key crime scene elements were identified: blitz attacks and lust murders. So these are violent, fast attacks that are probably sexually motivated. A high degree of psychopathology exhibited at the crime scenes. No evidence of sexual assault, possible manual strangulation, post-mortem mutilation and organ removal, but no torture. Elaboration of ritual. So this means that throughout the series of murders, we see more extravagant posing of the victims, more extravagant mutilation, all kind of following the same pattern, all building up to this crescendo that we see with the last murder. Victims being selected on the basis of accessibility, so they were street whores, prostitutes, so they were very accessible. And all the crimes took place on a Friday, Saturday, or Sunday in the early morning hours, which suggests that this person probably had some kind of a Monday through Friday job. It goes on to say, with the caution that profiling deals in probabilities and generalities, not certainties, the FBI report suggests that the Ripper may have had these following characteristics. He was a white male, 28 to 36 years of age. He was of average intelligence, and in all these cases, he was lucky, not clever. He was most likely single, never married, and had difficulty interacting with people in general and women in particular. Was nocturnal and possibly not accountable to anyone. He easily blended into his surroundings, possibly had poor personal hygiene or would appear disheveled. He was personally inadequate with a low self-image and diminished emotional responses, was quite a loner, withdrawn, and asocial, was of a lower social class, lived and or worked in Whitechapel and committed the crimes very close to home. Probably had a menial job with little or no interaction with the public, was possibly employed Monday through Friday, possibly as a butcher, a mortician's helper, a medical examiner's assistant, or a hospital attendant. He was most likely the product of a broken home and lacked consistent care and a stable adult role model as a child. There was probably no father or a very weak-willed father in the picture. I would guess there was no father in the picture. And he was raised by a dominant female figure who drank heavily, consorted with different men, and physically and possibly sexually abused him. And I think that's why he's targeting these types of prostitutes. Maybe his mother was one of these types of prostitutes. He was probably very domineering, very abusive towards him, and destroying these prostitutes is symbolic of him possibly destroying his mother. He was possibly a child who would set fires and abuse animals. We all know what those types of children turn out like. That's almost a stereotype when it comes to serial killers. It goes on to say he possibly hated, feared, and was intimidated by women. He internalized his anger. He was mentally disturbed and sexually inadequate, with much generalized rage directed at women. The nature of the murders and the mutilations being post-mortem shows a desire for power, control, and dominance, which he clearly lacked in his day-to-day life. It's believed that he would behave erratically. He would engage in sexually motivated attacks to, quote, neuter his victims. He would hunt nightly and was observed walking all over Whitechapel during the early morning hours, and would frequently drink in local pubs prior to the murders. However, he's good at blending in, so he's not going to stand out, so nobody's going to notice him. He's just another nobody, a face in the crowd. He probably just comes off to his victims as seeming very harmless. And in corroborating with the original investigators and doctors, the FBI states that he most likely did not have any medical knowledge or surgical expertise. He's just a hacker and a slasher, essentially. And he was probably interviewed by the police at some time during the Autumn of Terror. However, they probably just wrote him off as another nobody. And the FBI states that given his character and demeanor, he wasn't the type to mock the police with these letters and that all these letters are hoaxes. Which I guess is kind of where I stand with the letters. I don't think this was the type of guy who would taunt the police. And the FBI goes on in this profile to say that he definitely did not commit suicide after the murders had stopped. He wasn't the type of person to commit suicide. And I'd like to add a few things to that just to kind of round out this individual from stuff that I've observed. So obviously the guy wasn't forensically aware at all. Which, to be honest, this is the Victorian age. The police forces are primitive. Nobody's really all that forensically aware. But he doesn't seem to have any issue, dropping a bloody rag that turns out to be a piece of the apron not too far from his escape route or on his escape route. He's not afraid or even thinks about being seen or being the last person to be seen with these victims. He seems to be one of those types of people who has this deep, seething rage that kind of just sits there and boils and festers until it explodes into one of these attacks. And to be honest, given the types of people that were in Whitechapel at the time, I would guess that he's part of this immigrant or transient population. He's probably of Irish or Eastern European Jewish origin. I don't think he was ever at a point anything more than impoverished. I don't think he had any kind of fall from grace or fall from wealth or anything. And I believe that transient nature and that impoverished nature could be a reason as to why the Whitechapel murders finally stopped, because most serial killers don't stop. They keep going. And somebody like this was probably never going to stop, and he probably did kill more people later in life. However, it was unreported or never linked to the original killings. Which brings us really to who was Jack the Ripper and what happened to him. Now, there are thousands of suspects when it comes to the Ripper case. Just like the D.B. Cooper case, there were hundreds if not thousands of suspects. And to this day, people have wild and crazy ideas as to who the killer could have been. Some have even suggested people like Lewis Carroll, and even the American serial killer H.H. Holmes, who operated in the 1890s. But to be honest, most of the suspects that people have come up with are usually easily ruled out. They're usually suspects who come up because they have a propensity of violence towards women. John Pizer, our man Leather Apron from earlier, he was suspected, mostly based on some anti-Semitic stuff and that nickname of his, and this propensity of violence towards prostitutes. However, his name is cleared. He has alibis for those murders. And there are a number of other contemporaries of the time. This is mostly based on accounts where they've attacked other people and they try to link them to the Ripper cases, but the MOs are never the same. And some people argue that old adage, well, they start out with small crimes and then they work their way up. And that's for the most part true, but we gotta remember, the Ripper was mostly a slasher. He kills his victims in a quick slashing method and then mutilates the corpse. So earlier attacks would have possibly been slashing attacks. And there is one person who stands out to me who has a history of slashing attacks who a lot of people kind of overlook. Now, personally, I don't believe this guy to be the Ripper, just based on the general idea in my head of the Ripper's background of who he may be. However, there are some interesting nods here when it comes to this guy. His name was James Kelly. He was born 20 April 1860 in Preston as the son of Sarah Kelly, who left him in the care of his grandmother, a woman named Therese. In 1878, at the age of 18, he begins working as an upholsterer under the service of several successive employers. Now, upholsterers have access to a whole bunch of different types of knives, so he would have been familiar with knife work. And at the age of 20, he met 18-year-old Sarah Brider, who would later become his wife. However, he starts to develop an increasingly unpredictable and explosive temper, which eventually causes him to lose his job and to become just a terror to his wife. He would frequently berate her, he would display obsessive jealousy and accuse her of various infidelities. He even accused her of having an STI, possibly the clap or syphilis or something like that. And this is where it gets really crazy. So on June 21 of 1883, just 17 days after they were married, he slashes his wife's throat with a knife during a violent argument. 3 days after the attack, Sarah dies from the injury. John, he's arrested with no resistance. He was initially sentenced to hang, however, the superintendent of Broadmoor Hospital examined him and declared him insane. This was corroborated by his former employer speaking of his abnormal attitude and his propensity to explode out of nowhere. So he spends 5 years in Broadmoor and he's regarded as a model inmate. However, on 23 January 1888, he escapes from Broadmoor by fashioning a key out of a piece of metal he got a hold of, and he disappears. And he is not seen again for 40 years. A warrant is issued for his arrest and return to Broadmoor, and on November 10th, the police actually search his former wife's parents' house, but they don't find him there. However, something strange does happen. So on 12 February 1927, he just shows up at Broadmoor. At this time, he had been on the run for over 39 years, and he's literally begging to be readmitted. A local newspaper who reported on this stated that he said, "I am very tired and I want to die with my friends." Now, when he returns to the hospital, he's obviously not in good shape. He's old, he's sick, he obviously needs to be taken care of. He lives at the hospital for 2 more years, where he dies on 17 September 1929 of double lobular pneumonia. But something interesting does happen in these last 2 years, which make a lot of people believe that he was possibly the Ripper. He writes his memoirs. He also writes his own personal diary. And a couple of things he writes here kind of stands out. Now, these could be the ramblings of a crazy guy, but usually stuff written down in a diary comes from real feelings and real thoughts, so maybe take it with a grain of salt, but it could possibly be true. So in his memoirs, he never directly expresses, "Hey, I was Jack the Ripper." However, he does ramble about a hatred of prostitutes. And he acknowledges that he had taken up residence in London around the month of August of 1888 and resided there until November of 1888, after which he moves to America. And when asked what he was doing in the United States, he responded with fighting against evil. Now, what really makes it crazy is, as he's in America, there is a string of murders which involve prostitutes who have a very similar MO to the Whitechapel murders. Now, this is all circumstantial, of course, but you do have a situation where you have a guy with psychological problems who would explode into a rage, cuts his wife's throat only 17 days after marrying her, abandoned by his mother at birth, and basically raised by a grandmother who could have been very domineering, and then shows up in London during the correct time frame for the canonical 5 before moving to America shortly after the 5th victim is found. It's a pretty wild story, and I would put him on that list of suspects just based on that circumstantial evidence alone. However, it does sort of fall apart because there are some certain characteristics there that indicate that he's possibly not the Ripper. For one, he actually came from a very wealthy family. He was bequeathed 20,000 pounds to be administered by a fiduciary service, which he could use upon the age of reaching 25, from his family, so he would have grown up fairly well off compared to most other people. He was probably well educated by the time he becomes an upholsterer, and despite similarities between like the possibility of mental illness and explosive rage, a rage of hatred towards women, especially prostitutes, and his only known crime, slashing his wife's throat, it doesn't quite fit the Ripper. The Ripper seems to have some psychological problems that differ a little bit. Possible sexual inadequacy, probably a very low sense of self-esteem, and it's possible that the Ripper was never married and probably had a hard time interacting with women. And the Ripper is very familiar with his surroundings, his hunting grounds. The Ripper seems to be a Whitechapel local. He's not just somebody that just showed up in London after spending 5 years in a mental institution, who, for example, wouldn't know the layout of the streets. I feel like the Ripper was local to Whitechapel and not really an escapee from a mental institution. So James Kelly, while possibly my favorite suspect just based on a bunch of circumstantial stuff, I don't think he's actually the Ripper. To be honest, we are never going to know who the Ripper was unless we get a time machine and go back to that date and catch him in the act. At the end of the day, it was just some anonymous guy who probably worked a menial job, had a lot of mental health issues and issues with women in particular, and was a product of just a sad, unfortunate, anonymous life. Now, why did the Ripper murders stop? It could have been for a number of reasons. Some people believe that the Ripper stopped because he came to America. There are cases involving prostitutes in New York and in Texas, which do bear some similarities, and the newspapers went wild with this. Some believe that the Ripper went other places, and who knows, maybe he did disappear somewhere. He could have gone anywhere at that time. The British Empire was everywhere at that time. He could have gone to Africa, he could have gone to Australia, Asia. Just depends on if you're willing to go and if you can afford the passage. But what I think probably happened, what most likely happened, is at some point not long after the murders, the Ripper probably dies. Because realistically speaking, if he had remained alive, he would have continued to kill. And he would have continued to kill in the same fashion that he was killing in Whitechapel. We have to remember the area he's living in is a squalid, disease-filled slum. A place where poverty and filth was rampant. This is a time before indoor plumbing, so sewage and waste, it would just wash up into people's basements sometimes. So you could easily become ill from just being in these surroundings. Not to mention the fact that alcoholism and crime, and I'm not talking about just crime as in murder, I'm talking about fights, barroom brawls, gang violence. Hell, the first Whitechapel murder was attributed to gang violence. Now that one wasn't attributed to the Ripper, but it was a gang of, I think, 3 guys. There was all this stuff going on, so each day could have been your last. And hell, with winter coming, you could just freeze to death in the street if you couldn't afford a bed for the night. So the Ripper could have just died from any number of these things. You know, maybe he got mugged and stabbed by a gang of muggers, and then, I don't know, dies from a subsequent infection in a sick house somewhere. Maybe he dies in an accident at whatever he does for work. I guess what I'm getting around is, I think he died. And I think he died not too long after the murders. Just some anonymous guy, possibly in a sick house somewhere, whom the world would never know was the infamous Jack the Ripper. And on that note, I am going to end it here. So, once again, this is Mike, and I thank you for listening to the Season 4 finale of Urban Legends and Mythology. No rambling post-episode rants this time. I just want to encourage you, if you like what I'm doing, to share it across the social medias, share it with your friends. And if you want to be a rock star, you can always go to that Support This Podcast link in the description of every episode and kick me a few bucks. Every dime I get from that goes back into making this show better. And I truly thank you guys who are doing that. You guys are the true rock stars. Now the show is going on a break for a couple of weeks, but I will be back in mid-August with the 5th season opener. Stay tuned, you're gonna love it, and I will see you there.